Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I remember that day in 2019 so vividly, even though I've tried to push it out of my mind. It was supposed to be a simple escape. A short camping trip with my two closest friends, Elias and Ford, near a rural area by Oakridge, Tennessee. I had been going through a rough patch in my personal life and just needed some quiet time outdoors. We picked a spot deep in the woods, well off the beaten paths. No cell service, no people, just nature and the three of us. It felt right at first, just the three of us, a small campfire, a clear night sky, and 1,000 stars overhead. We set up camp before nightfall. Our tents were pitched in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the horizon. The only light after sundown came from our fire and the moon filtering weakly through the canopy. The temperature was pleasant enough, cool but not uncomfortable, and the forest around us was surprisingly quiet, aside from the usual insects and distant rustling of small animals. We sat around the fire, chatting and laughing, telling dumb jokes and swapping a few scary stories like you do when you're out there with old friends. None of us really believed in any of it. It was just a way to pass the time. At some point we started talking about local legends and those old cryptid tales we'd read online, things people claimed they'd seen in the Appalachian region. We joked about it, teased each other. I remember Elias making fun of me when I got jumpy at some branch cracking in the distance. Ford tried to reassure me that it was probably just a deer, and I laughed it off. That's when we heard it. A scream or howl, some sound I still can't properly describe. It was far off, but it carried through the trees. It wasn't a coyote, it wasn't a bobcat. Those make freaky noises, sure, but this was different. It sounded deeper, heavier, almost human, but not quite. The sound seemed to linger in the air, and for a second, I had this weird feeling that the forest was holding its breath. The mood shifted. We all felt it. Our banter stopped. Elias stood up, shining his flashlight into the darkness behind us. He said he heard something moving between the trees and needed to check it out. Ford and I told him it was probably nothing, but Elias insisted. I could see this determined look on his face, like he just had to confirm it, so we could all go back to normal. He walked off into the darkness, and we watched his flashlight bob through the undergrowth until it was just a faint glow, and then nothing. We waited. At first, we tried to keep calm. Maybe he was just taking a leak or trying to scare us by staying quiet. But the silence went on too long. Ford and I started calling out Elias's name, keeping our voices low at first, then louder when he didn't answer. The only response we got was more silence. The wind picked up slightly, causing the branches to rustle overhead, and I remember how tense my body felt. My heart was pounding, and I kept shining my flashlight into the dark, but all I saw were tree trunks and bushes. Ford and I grabbed a lantern and my pocket knife. Pathetic protection, I know, but we were desperate. We moved away from the fire, following the path Elias had taken. Every step was careful, and I became hyper-aware of everything. My own breathing, Ford's footsteps behind me, the crunch of leaves under our boots. The trees felt too close, the darkness too complete. I tried to keep track of where the campsite was, glancing back now and then to see the faint glow of our fire through the dense brush. We eventually came to a small clearing, not much bigger than our campsite. The ground was disturbed, leaves and dirt kicked around, and I saw signs that something happened there. Some kind of struggle, broken twigs, scuff marks. I remember noticing a strange smell in the air. It reminded me of damp fur and old sweat, something wild and unwashed. We looked around, aiming the lantern's beam in every direction. That's when we saw it, just for a split second. I caught its shape first, tall, bulky, covered in dark hair. It blended into the forest shadows so well that I almost didn't notice it until it moved slightly. Its eyes reflected the lantern light with a dull glow, not bright like an animal's, but noticeable enough to give away its position. It stood upright, hunched but still towering, and I could see massive shoulders and a broad chest. It was not a bear. I know what bears look like, how they move, and this thing was different. Its arms seemed too long, its posture oddly human-like, but its face. I only saw it for a moment, but I'll never forget it. The face had features that were somewhat human but covered in hair, and the expression it wore was something I can only describe as intensely aware. It knew we were there, and it didn't seem afraid. We didn't see Elias. That realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Elias was just gone. We called his name, even though I knew deep down that if he could come back or answer, he would have already. We didn't find blood or anything obvious, but the absence was worse. It was like Elias had been plucked out of existence, leaving only confusion behind. The creature made a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't a roar. It was more like a deep grunt or growl, a warning maybe. I felt an overwhelming terror that made it hard to think straight. My hands were shaking, and Ford was breathing hard, whispering curses under his breath. We backed away slowly at first, but as soon as we got enough distance, we turned and bolted toward the camp. Once we got back, we grabbed whatever we could, backpacks, keys, some of our gear. We didn't even bother packing the tents properly. I just remember shoving some stuff into the back of the car as fast as I could, my eyes darting between the trees. The worst part was that I could sense it was still out there. We heard a heavy step, a crack of a branch. I spotted its silhouette near the tree line, just watching us, almost calmly, which somehow made it more terrifying than if it had charged right at us. I remember my throat being dry and my stomach twisting. We shouted Elias's name again, begging for a response, but there was nothing. We had no way to call for help from that spot. Our phones had no signal, and we weren't about to split up again. I started the car, and Ford jumped in. I didn't waste a second. We took off down that narrow dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the car as we sped back towards town. We didn't say much during that drive. We were both in shock, and I was trying to keep it together enough not to crash. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what we'd just seen and what happened to Elias. When we finally got back into Oakridge, we headed straight for the sheriff's office. We tried explaining what we saw. We were both out of breath, talking over each other, trying to describe the creature and what happened. The sheriff listened carefully, probably noticing how genuinely freaked out we were. There were no similar reports that he could recall, nothing about missing hikers or strange animals. I remember feeling both frustrated and relieved at the same time. Frustrated because we had no proof and no answers. Relieved because at least the sheriff didn't laugh in our faces. He said they'd send someone out to look, and we left, still shaking, not sure what else to do. Over the next few days, we stuck around, trying to find any trace of Elias. We met some locals, heard rumors about strange noises in the forest, stories that never made it into the news. Nothing concrete, just hints and half-whispered tales, and not a single clue that led us to Elias. Ford and I checked with search parties and called every day, but nothing turned up. It was like he just vanished. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened out there. It wasn't just some trick of the light, and it wasn't my imagination. Ford saw it too. We know what we saw. That thing was real, and it was out there in those woods, watching us. It changed the way I think about nature, about the unknown. Sometimes I lie awake at night trying to replay the moment in my head, wondering if we did something wrong, if we should have gone after Elias sooner or stayed longer, or if there was any way to have prevented what happened. But it's all pointless now. Elias is gone, and I'm stuck with this memory that feels more like a scar than a story. I've come to accept that I'll never get a neat explanation. Maybe no one will ever find out what really happened that night. The only thing I know for sure is that I saw something I never thought could exist. It was there, towering in the dark, making a sound that still haunts me. And in that one single night, the forest went from a place of peace and comfort to a source of nightmares. Even now, years later, I can't walk in the woods without feeling watched. The memory of that creature, and the fact that Elias never came back, remains as a reminder that some things out there don't fit into the world we think we know. Story 2. I remember it was late May of 1997, near Enis, Montana. I had decided to go up to my grandparents' old cabin, which had been sitting empty for years in a patch of pine forest near the foothills. I needed some time away, and that place was like my own little hideout. It wasn't big, just a single-room cabin with old furniture and dusty photo frames, but it had a certain warmth, a memory of quieter times I spent there as a child. I guess I wanted to reconnect with something peaceful after a rough patch in my life. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just wanted some calm, maybe catch some trout at the nearby creek and clear my head. That day, I went off exploring with a beat-up backpack, an old fishing rod, and a yellowed map that might have been older than I was. The sun was out, the sky was clear, and the morning air smelled like pine sap. The trail I took wasn't the main one leading to the creek. I decided to follow a faint old path beyond the property line, places my grandparents had talked about but never really marked. I figured I'd try somewhere new, maybe find a hidden spot to drop my line in the water. The first half hour or so felt normal. I could hear squirrels rustling, distant birds calling out. My boots sank slightly into the damp ground where the snowmelt had softened the earth. But at some point, I couldn't say exactly when, I realized it had gotten eerily quiet. I mean, completely silent. No bird calls, no wind in the branches, no faint sounds of running water. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped walking and stood there trying to figure out what was off. Right around then, I noticed these tracks in the ground. I saw them near a slight slope where the ground was softer. They were huge, maybe twice as long and wide as my foot, and the shape was sort of like a human footprint, only broader, with toes that seemed oddly spaced. They were definitely not bear prints. I've seen plenty of bear tracks in my life, and these didn't look anything like that. They were too elongated, too defined in a way. I knelt down and stared at them for a good minute, feeling this uneasy sensation crawl into my stomach. As I stood up, I caught a whiff of something. A foul, heavy odor drifted through the still air. It smelled damp and animal-like, but also kind of like rotten vegetation or maybe stagnant water. I couldn't pinpoint it. I tried breathing through my mouth so I wouldn't gag. My heart was pounding, and I started thinking, maybe I should head back. I'm not a fearful person by nature, but something about this silence and these weird tracks made me want to leave that area as fast as possible. Still, part of me was curious. I took another few steps forward, scanning the trees and undergrowth, listening hard. Nothing. Just silence. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap. It was faint but clear, somewhere off to my left. I turned my head and lifted the small flashlight I always carry. Even in daylight, I keep it for looking into dark crevices or under logs. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just pine trunks and ferns. But then my eyes adjusted to a shape standing behind some branches. I froze. There was something massive there, partially hidden. Tall and broad, covered in dark brownish hair, not fur like a bear's, but something coarser, longer. It stood on two legs. I swear, it was taller than any man I've ever met, maybe 7 or 8 feet. I couldn't see its face well at first, but I could sense it was watching me. I didn't feel brave. I felt exposed and stupid for coming out here alone. I slowly lowered the flashlight, thinking maybe if I didn't shine it right at it, it wouldn't be provoked. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. Then the creature stepped forward just a fraction, and I caught a glimpse of its eyes, dark, deep-set eyes that seemed to watch me with a kind of cautious intelligence. It wasn't just some dumb animal wandering by. It knew I was there, and it was sizing me up. It made a sound, not a roar, not a scream, but a low, rumbling grunt, like a warning. My chest tightened, and I felt this primal fear I can't quite describe. I knew I had to get out of there, but I also knew if I bolted, it might chase me. So I started backing away, slow and steady. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, but I was shaking, and my boots brushed against dead leaves, making way too much noise in the silence. I moved maybe 20 yards back the way I came, and I could still feel it there. I didn't dare turn around to run. Every few steps, I'd hear these soft, heavy movements behind me, like something big shifting its weight. Occasionally, I'd catch a brief glimpse of it through the trees, always staying just far enough that I never got a full look. Its outline was massive, shoulders incredibly wide, the limbs longer than they should have been for a normal man. The sun was starting to dip lower, which only made me more panicked. I needed to reach the cabin before it got dark. At some point, I couldn't control my nerves anymore, and I started moving faster, trying to remember the way I had come. The forest felt like a maze. I tripped over a root and landed on my knee, feeling a sharp pain shoot up my leg. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing there, but the smell lingered. I felt watched. I scrambled to my feet and hurried on. When I finally recognized the old cedar stump near the property line, my chest almost burst with relief. The cabin wasn't too far now. Once inside, I slammed the door and bolted it. I know how this sounds, like some campfire story, but I'm telling you, I felt more terrified in that moment than I ever had in my life. I quickly shut the windows and drew the old curtains. I turned off all the lights and just sat near the window with my grandfather's old rifle in my hands. I had no idea what good it would do against something like that, but holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. The cabin was silent except for my breathing. Outside, the forest seemed dead quiet again, not a single sound. Hours passed, and darkness settled in. I occasionally heard something move around outside, maybe branches snapping softly. It never pounded on the door or tried to break in, nothing dramatic like that, but knowing it was out there was terrifying enough. My imagination ran wild. I pictured it standing just beyond the tree line, staring at the cabin, waiting. Waiting for what, I don't know. I had no idea what it wanted or why it showed itself. Every so often I'd catch another faint whiff of that smell coming through a crack somewhere. It sent shivers down my spine. I barely slept. I think I might have dozed off for a few minutes here and there, but every little sound yanked me back awake. I just wanted the morning to come, so I could pack up and leave that place behind. The cabin suddenly felt like a flimsy cardboard box in the middle of nowhere. All those old memories of it being cozy and safe were gone. Now it felt like a trap. When the first light of dawn started filtering through the curtains, I knew I had to leave. I gathered my things, whatever I could stuff into my backpack, and stepped outside. The world seemed normal again. The birds were chirping. The morning air was crisp and clean. It felt surreal, like I had imagined the whole encounter. But the tracks were still there, faint impressions in the soil. I took one last look at them and felt that uneasy knot in my stomach again. I walked quickly back down the trail that led to the dirt road and eventually into town. I must have looked like a wreck when I stepped into the local bar later that morning. A couple of the old-timers there asked if I was okay, and I just shrugged, not sure what to say. I knew they'd think I was crazy if I mentioned what happened. I ended up talking around it, saying I saw something weird out in the woods. Some of them just smirked. Maybe they thought I got spooked by a bear. A couple of them asked questions, but I didn't know how to explain something that still didn't make sense to me. So I just kept quiet. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there. I've never gone back to that cabin. I've read about strange encounters in the woods, people claiming to see large, hairy creatures. I always thought those stories were just tall tales until I had my own experience. I can't prove it. I didn't take any pictures or bring back any evidence, but I know what I felt, and I know that silence still haunts me. The way the forest just went dead quiet, and the look in those dark eyes, like it was sizing me up, trying to understand what I was doing there. It never attacked me, never tried to hurt me, but that fear stuck with me. I think about it sometimes and wonder if maybe I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see, something that's always been out there, just beyond where we dare to go. I'll never have a clean explanation. All I know is that on that day in 1997, up near Enis, Montana, I ran into something that shouldn't exist. After that morning, it was gone as if it never happened, and I've never been able to make sense of it since. Story 3. I remember it was early in the summer of 2018, and I had decided to head out near Dalega, Georgia, in one of those spots close to the Appalachian foothills. It wasn't a place with an official trail or anything like that. I just wanted to fish in peace. I had a lot on my mind. Work wasn't going great. My marriage felt like it was on thin ice, and I just needed some time alone where I could breathe. No phones, no other people, just me, the water, and the sound of birds. The plan was simple. Park my old truck somewhere off a dirt road I knew, hike into the woods until I hit a small stream, and spend the afternoon fishing. I got there around midday. The drive along the dusty backroads was soothing, and when I finally parked, I could feel the tension I'd been carrying slip away, at least a little. The spot I'd chosen wasn't official. You wouldn't find it on any tourist map. It was just a narrow creek running through thick forest. Tall trees surrounded me, their leaves filtering the sunlight in these shifting patterns of brightness and shade. I remember thinking how quiet it all seemed. The only real sounds were birds calling out from somewhere deep in the branches and the gentle trickle of the water. It felt good, normal, safe. For the first few hours, everything was fine. I caught a couple of small fish, nothing impressive, but enough to keep me entertained. I even took a break to sit on a smooth rock by the stream, taking in the view, thinking about life and what I was going to do about my job. There was that pleasant scent of wet moss and fresh leaves all around. Nothing seemed wrong, at least not at first. But as the afternoon wore on, something changed in the atmosphere. It's hard to explain, but the woods got quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. The birdsong that had been my constant background music was fading out. It was like someone turned the volume knob down on the entire forest. Even the breeze that had been rustling the leaves seemed to have disappeared. It was just still. And in that stillness, I started feeling uneasy. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck, like you're being watched? That's exactly what I felt. I tried to shake it off. I'm not the type who believes in this kind of thing. I'm a pretty straightforward guy, not easily rattled by weird vibes. But that day, it was different. I couldn't ignore it. I found myself scanning the tree line, straining my ears to catch any hint of what might be out there. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a grunt, but deeper. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. I've heard bears before, I've heard deer, and even feral hogs. But this was off. It was too deep, too resonant. It gave me chills instantly. I told myself it was probably just some big animal, maybe a large boar, but something told me that wasn't right. This sound had a weird cadence to it, like it came from something with a big chest and a lot of power behind it. My heart started pounding. Still, I tried to keep calm and continued along the creek, just a few steps further, thinking maybe I'd see whatever it was and confirm it was nothing special. That's when I noticed the footprints. I almost missed them because they were partially hidden by some brush and the soft ground. But one step caught my eye. These were huge, human-like footprints, deeper and larger than any human foot could make. I remember kneeling down, running my fingertips over the edges of one of the tracks. The impression was clear and defined. I could see toes, like a bare human foot, but twice the size and incredibly wide. The ground was moist and soft, and to make such a deep imprint, you'd have to weigh a lot. A whole lot. I stood up, my legs feeling shaky. My brain was wrestling with what I was seeing. I couldn't come up with a logical explanation. My gut was screaming at me to get out of there. But I guess curiosity got the best of me. I took a few more steps, trying to see if there were more tracks. And that's when I got the scent. Imagine wet fur mixed with a kind of musky, almost rotten odor. It hit me hard, and I gagged a bit. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, and I've smelled plenty of dead animals, plenty of weird plant decay. This wasn't like that. It smelled like something alive and heavy that hadn't washed in years. I froze. I didn't hear any branches snapping, but I could sense movement. And then I saw it. Between two large trees, maybe 30 yards away, something moved. At first, I only caught a blur of dark brown, almost black hair. Then it leaned into a patch of filtered light, and my breath caught in my throat. It was upright, tall, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. The shoulders were massive, and it had thick arms. The face wasn't clear from that distance, but I could tell it had a shape more human than bear. Its body was covered in hair, but not like a bear's fur. It was longer in places, not uniform, and the body shape was wrong for a bear. It stood there, half hidden behind a tree trunk, looking at me. I swear I could feel its eyes on me. My stomach dropped. I knew this wasn't something I should stick around to study. A huge wave of dread washed over me, and my heart was hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. Without taking my eyes off this thing, I slowly took a step back, then another. I hoped if I just moved slowly and calmly, maybe it wouldn't follow. But as I backed away, I saw it shift its weight, and I heard that low grunt again, like it was telling me not to even think about running. When I finally forced myself to turn and walk, then jog, then flat-out run, I could hear it behind me, not stomping or crashing through the brush like a clumsy animal would, but moving smoothly, covering ground fast. It was almost graceful, which scared me even more. I wasn't prepared for speed. I tried to be quiet as I ran, but I was panicking, tripping over exposed roots, scratching my arms and face on branches I didn't even see coming. Each time I stumbled, I just knew it was going to close the gap and grab me. I could still catch that awful scent every so often, stronger as it got closer, then fading if I managed to put a few more feet between us. I finally broke through the thicker brush and spotted my old truck where I'd parked it. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I managed to sprint toward it. I fumbled with the door handle, practically throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. I locked the doors out of some instinct, even though that wouldn't have done much if it decided to break a window. In that moment, I felt like a cornered animal myself, just desperate to get out of there. The engine took a second to turn over. My heart nearly stopped, but it roared to life, and I jammed the gas pedal to the floor, sending up a cloud of dust and gravel as I tore back down that dirt road. When I finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, I saw it. It had stepped into the open road behind me, just standing there. It wasn't chasing anymore. It looked like it was just watching me leave. Even from that distance, I got the sense that it knew exactly what it was doing, like it was making sure I understood whose territory I'd stumbled into. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I could barely breathe, and my hands were shaking so much I had trouble lighting a cigarette I'd left in the glove box. I tried to tell a friend who was a forest ranger about it later, just to get it off my chest, but you can guess how that went. He was polite, but obviously thought I'd either been mistaken or was making it up. I didn't push the issue. I know what I saw. I know what I heard and smelled and felt that day. It wasn't some trick of the light or a bear walking on its hind legs. I don't know what it was, but I know it was real. To this day, I still get that uneasy feeling when I think about it, and I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't know how to explain it. Part of me wants to say it was just one of those weird moments in the wilderness that you can't fully understand, but I can't shake the certainty that there's something out there, something big and smart, and maybe not too friendly. The strangest part is how it just ended. One moment I was running for my life, and the next I was driving away, watching it stand there in my mirror, almost calm, like it had decided to let me go. And I've never really come to terms with that. All I know is I saw it, and I felt its presence, and it's something I'll never forget. Story 4. I remember that afternoon in a way I still can't fully explain. It was back in 2009, just outside DeSoto, Kansas. I had been dealing with a lot of crap at the time, work stress, a recent breakup, and I just needed to escape for a while. So I chose Shining Mission Park, a place I had heard about, but never actually visited. It was supposed to be quiet, with these old trails nobody really used anymore. I thought some peace and fresh air would help clear my head. I parked my car near this old, barely marked trail, the kind you find on outdated maps, where the signage is faded and the path is half covered by overgrowth. I actually liked that it felt a bit off the beaten track. I started walking, and right away, the silence was kind of comforting. I could smell the grass, feel the warm sunlight filtering through the trees. Birds were chirping, and I felt like maybe I'd done the right thing by coming there. It was calming, at least at first. After maybe half an hour of walking, I started to notice something strange. It was the quiet. It had gone from peaceful to unsettling. The birds I'd heard earlier weren't making a sound. Even the insects seemed to vanish. Everything felt sort of held in place, like the woods were holding their breath. I remember stopping, looking around, and trying to figure out what was off. I didn't see anything out of place at first, just trees, underbrush, old fallen branches. Still, this sense of being watched started to creep up on me. I kept walking, trying to shake it off. I told myself it was normal for wildlife to go silent if there was a predator around. Maybe a large animal was nearby, a bobcat or a coyote. I was nervous but still curious, not ready to turn back just yet. Then I noticed footprints in the dirt. They weren't like anything I'd seen before. They looked almost human, but enormous, at least twice the size of my own. The toes were broad and spread out. I crouched down and touched the impression. The soil was damp, so it kept the shape pretty well. I could even see detail in the toes. It sent a jolt of fear through me, but I tried not to panic. I thought maybe some prankster made them, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but they were too crisp, too fresh. I got up and kept going, more slowly now, feeling my heart rate climb. The silence pressed down on me as I moved. Then came the smell. It was sudden, like I'd stepped into a zone of rotten leaves, wet fur, and something else I couldn't identify. It was strong and got stronger as I advanced. I could swear it smelled like a mix of damp hair and stale sweat, maybe even a hint of something like decaying vegetation. I stopped in my tracks, breathing carefully so I wouldn't gag. My skin prickled, and I remember feeling a wave of cold sweat on my forehead. I glanced around, and that's when I saw movement. Nothing obvious, just a branch shifting where there was no wind, something large passing behind the thicker trees. I strained my eyes, heart pounding, and then I saw it. It was tall, way taller than me, covered in dark, matted hair. Its shoulders were huge, its arms long. At first I tried to convince myself it was a bear standing upright, or maybe a person in a costume, but the shape was all wrong. It had this hulking frame, and the head seemed more domed, less like a human skull. It stood maybe 30-40 feet away, partially obscured by branches and leaves, but I got a good look at its face, or at least the outline of it. The eyes were dark, deep-set, and I swear I felt them lock onto me. That's when the reality hit me. I might be looking at something people talk about only in whispers. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you use. I never really believed in that stuff, but seeing it there, I couldn't deny what I was looking at. My stomach knotted up, and I felt my knees weaken. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. It made a low sound, not a roar or a scream, but a kind of deep grunt or rumble, like a warning. It didn't rush at me right then. It just stood there, stiff and cautious. I didn't know what to do. I held my breath and took a slow step back. The thing tilted its head slightly, as if trying to figure me out. I tried to maintain eye contact without looking threatening. Inside, my mind was racing. Should I run? Should I stay still? When I took another careful step back, I think my foot snapped a small twig, or maybe I dragged it against a fallen branch. I'm not sure what caused the noise, but it was enough. The creature's posture changed instantly. It let out a sharper sound, louder, and took several steps closer. Now I could see its full height, towering over me, and those massive footprints made sense. Its presence was suffocating. I felt this jolt of raw fear. I couldn't think straight. I just turned and ran. I bolted back the way I came, branches whipping at my face and arms. I stumbled more than once, my legs feeling like jelly. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, leaves crunching under a massive weight. That was the worst part, knowing it was following, not just watching anymore. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was too focused on not tripping and breaking my neck. My heart hammered so hard I thought I'd collapse from the panic alone. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like an eternity. At some point, the sound of those heavy steps got quieter, or maybe I was just in such a panic that everything blurred together. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder, but didn't see anything. That didn't calm me down, though. I kept running until I burst out of the denser woods and spotted my car through the thinning trees. I yanked the car door open, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't get the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I tore out of there, dust and gravel flying. Only once I hit the main road did I realize how sweaty I was. I could barely breathe. The terror was still pulsing through me as I sped all the way back into town, constantly checking the rearview mirror like it might be chasing me down the highway. When I finally made it back, I tried telling a friend what happened. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. The cops I spoke to just nodded and said they'd check it out, but I could tell they didn't believe a word of it. No one took it seriously. It made me question myself. But I know what I saw. I remember the smell, the massive footprints, the shape of its body, the way it felt staring right into my eyes. I can't shake that feeling even now. It's been years, and sometimes I still wake up sweating, thinking about that silent forest and how suddenly everything changed. I didn't see any blood or anything like that. I wasn't attacked, not physically. But that encounter was enough. Knowing something like that is out there, moving quietly through the trees, watching from the shadows, it's still terrifying. I can't explain it. I don't know if it was protecting territory, if it was curious, or if it wanted me gone. All I know is that I'll never forget that day. It taught me that the world might not be as simple and safe as I thought. I still have no real explanation, and I guess I never will. It just happened, and then it was over. But that image will always be stuck in my mind, and I still avoid that park, just in case. Story 5. I've been holding this in for a long time, and I guess today I just felt the urge to share it. This happened in 2016, during a trip I took with a small group of friends who called themselves the Trail Stompers. The whole idea was to explore less-traveled parts of the Adirondacks near Old Forge, New York. It wasn't anything heroic or extreme, just a small adventure. At the time, I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but I liked the camaraderie and the feeling of pushing myself into places that felt a bit off the beaten path. Nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that day. We started early, and the mood was good. It wasn't a scorching day. The sky had a thin layer of clouds that took the edge off the sun. There were 4 of us, me, Alden, Ricky, Lila, and Grant. We were all in that easygoing mood, joking around and calling ourselves adventurers, even though none of us were seasoned hikers. The plan was pretty straightforward. Follow a barely marked trail, find this small cave Ricky had read about somewhere, snap a few pictures, then head back before dark. We were feeling good, confident even, as we moved deeper into that quiet stretch of forest. As we pushed further, the trail got narrower, the underbrush became thicker, and I started to realize just how rarely people ventured out there. At some point, I noticed that the usual forest sounds were fading. It's not like we were somewhere haunted or anything, but it felt strange. The birds that had been chirping quietly just stopped. Even the rustling of small animals or the distant hum of insects seemed to vanish. It was just us, our footsteps on damp leaves, and the subtle sound of our own breathing. I remember feeling a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It wasn't a sudden terror, more like that nagging feeling that something's off. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the nervous one. Eventually we found the cave, if you could call it that. It wasn't some huge cavern, more like a low, narrow opening at the base of a mossy, rocky incline. The entrance was partially hidden by ferns and shrubs. I remember we all got excited, like kids who just found a secret hideout. We switched on our flashlights and stepped in. The temperature dropped almost instantly. It smelled stale, like old dirt and wet stone. The beam of my flashlight showed walls with strange markings, scratches or carvings, hard to tell, but definitely not random. They looked old, though I'm no expert in that kind of thing. The silence in there felt heavier. Even our breathing sounded too loud. I could feel my heartbeat thumping in my ears as we moved deeper. Lila was ahead of me, Ricky and Grant were behind. None of us spoke. Then we heard it. A scratching sound against rock, like something big shifting its weight. I froze, and I'm pretty sure everyone else did too. I aimed my flashlight toward the far end, where the shadows got thick, and that's when I saw it. I still have no perfect words for what I saw. It was crouched low, a massive figure covered in dark, matted hair. Not a bear. Its proportions were too strange, its limbs too long. It looked half human, half something else, with broad shoulders and an almost intelligent look in its eyes. Those eyes reflected the flashlight beam in a weird way, making them appear momentarily red. The creature's face wasn't fully human or ape, something in between. I felt my stomach drop. I remember my pulse hammering, and I'm pretty sure I was shaking. We all just stared at it, and it stared right back at us. I wanted to speak, to say something, but my mouth went dry. Lila let out a small, involuntary gasp. Ricky took a step back, and his foot scraped noisily on the rocky floor. The creature let out a low, rumbling sound. Not exactly a roar, more like a warning, deep and guttural. I could feel the vibration of that sound in my chest. I tried to move, but it was like my legs didn't want to obey. The creature shifted, rising slightly. That's when I realized it was huge, easily over 7 feet if it stood straight. Its presence filled that cramped space. My mind was racing. Was it going to rush at us? Could we even get past it to the exit? I remember thinking how insane this all was, and how nobody was going to believe us if we got out. If we got out. Out of nowhere, Grant shone his flashlight straight into its face. The beam was bright, and the creature seemed bothered by it. It squinted, growled, and lurched a bit to the side. That gave us just enough hesitation on its part. Without saying a word, we all turned and practically stumbled over each other, trying to run back toward the entrance. I remember scraping my shoulder on a jagged rock and not even caring. I just needed out. The air felt suffocating, the smell of dirt and that musky animal scent lingering in my nostrils. When we burst out into the open, it felt like we'd just surfaced from deep underwater. I sucked in the fresh air, trying to steady my racing heart. For a second, I expected it to follow us immediately. I expected those huge arms to reach out and drag one of us back in. But nothing happened. The forest still felt off, but at least we had space to move. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. We knew what we had to do. Get back to the car. I don't remember the exact route we took on the way back. We basically stumbled through the undergrowth, trying to retrace our steps in a hurry. Branches whipped against my face, and I nearly twisted my ankle on a root. I could taste adrenaline in the back of my throat. There were no jokes now, no casual banter, just frantic glances over our shoulders, half expecting to see that creature pushing through the brush, moving with some inhuman speed to catch up to us. After what felt like hours, though it might have been only 30 minutes, we made it back to the starting point where our car was parked. None of us paused to reflect or calm down until we were all locked inside, doors shut, engine running. Even then, there was this tense silence. I could see Ricky's hands shaking as he fumbled with his seatbelt. Lila kept looking out the back window. Grant was breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his temple. I think I asked, "Did we just see what I think we saw?" No one answered directly. Just nervous looks and a shared understanding that we had stumbled onto something none of us ever wanted to witness again. We drove away, not saying much, each one of us lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, Ricky mentioned something like, "We can't tell anyone about this. They'll think we're crazy." Lila nodded, still pale. Grant just stared straight ahead, knuckles white on the steering wheel. I remember trying to replay it in my mind, questioning my own memory. Could it have been a bear with a weird posture, some trick of the flashlight, a stress-induced hallucination? But I know what I saw. We all know what we saw. That thing was real. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain it. We never reported it, never really spoke much about it among ourselves. It felt easier to pretend it never happened. But every time I think about heading into unfamiliar woods, I feel that same tension creeping up my spine. I know there's something out there. Maybe it's always been there, just avoiding us. Maybe we were just stupidly lucky to get away. I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was some unknown species, maybe a misidentified animal, but deep down, I know that's not it. There's something about the way it watched us, the intelligence in its eyes, that freaks me out. It wasn't just a random forest creature. It knew we were there, and it didn't like it one bit. After that day, I've read stories of people claiming they've seen weird human-like creatures in the woods, and I get chills because I can relate. I know how easy it is for others to dismiss these stories as myths or attention-seeking lies. I'm not here to convince anyone. Honestly, I don't care if people believe me or not. I just needed to get this off my chest. The memory's been sitting inside me, a raw knot of fear and confusion. That encounter ended as abruptly as it started. We were just normal people looking for a bit of excitement in the wilderness. We found something we never asked for. It stayed behind in that damp, silent cave, and we drove away with no proof except our own shaking voices. I can't explain it, and I probably never will. It's been years, and I still see those eyes in my mind whenever I think about dark places and heavy silence. I guess that's all I can say. We went looking for a cave that day, and we found something that still haunts me. I've never gone back to that area, never tried to locate the cave again. Some secrets are better left alone, and whatever was in that cave, it can stay there. I know what I saw, and nothing will ever make me forget it. Story 6. I remember the exact day, sometime in late spring 2013, because everything was still pretty green but not too overgrown, and the air had that warm smell of damp earth that I always liked. Back then, I was living on my family's old property just outside Brimstone, Kentucky. There's not much to say about the town itself. A couple hundred people, maybe. Most of my days I spent working the small farm I'd inherited, tending the same fields and trees my father and grandfather had worked before me. Nothing unusual ever happened around there, and that's exactly how I liked it. I never cared much for weird stories or local legends. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. But that afternoon changed something in me. It was late in the day, the sun hanging low, and I was feeling restless. I decided to leave the main house and take a walk into the woods behind my property. There was an old trail back there, a narrow path snaking through the undergrowth and into the deeper parts of the forest. I thought a quick walk might clear my head. Maybe I'd be out there an hour, tops, just strolling, letting my thoughts drift. I remember the light that day, the way it filtered through the leaves, casting these yellowish-green patterns on the ground. It was quiet, too. Normally you hear a lot of birds, maybe a squirrel rustling around, but it felt like everything was holding its breath. I noticed it after maybe 10 minutes in. I hadn't seen a single rabbit dart away, hadn't heard any usual forest chatter, just silence and that soft crunch of my boots on the trail. Then I started noticing other things. There was this weird smell in the air. Hard to explain. It wasn't just animal musk or wet soil. It had a sharp, almost acidic edge that made the back of my nose burn. I actually stopped walking and took a few careful breaths, trying to place it. I couldn't. It reminded me of old cleaning chemicals, but mixed with something wild and dirty. Totally off. The deeper I went, the stronger it got. Then I saw branches snapped high up on tree trunks, broken clean through at a height taller than I could reach. I know these woods. I've hunted deer there. I've gathered firewood. I know what a normal broken branch looks like. But these breaks were fresh and splintered, like something big and heavy had forced its way through. Then I noticed impressions on the ground, almost like footprints, but not shaped like any I recognized. Large, too big for a bear. I mean, I've seen black bears before, and I know what their tracks look like. These were different, longer and more human-like, but way larger than my own boots, at least twice the size. I started feeling uneasy. I'm not the superstitious type, but I can't deny when something feels off. My gut was telling me to turn around, but I pushed on a bit further, just to see if maybe a big storm had taken down some branches or a prankster had been messing around. I don't know what I expected, but I sure as hell didn't expect what I saw next. I heard it before I saw it. A scraping noise like something hard dragging against a tree trunk. I clicked on my flashlight. Yeah, it was still light out, but under those thick trees it got dim pretty fast. I swept the beam around and caught a shape moving behind a wide trunk. For a split second, I thought it was a big guy in a dark coat, maybe a hunter on my property. But then it stepped partially into view, and I knew it wasn't a person. It stood taller than any man I've ever seen, probably close to 7 feet, maybe more. It was covered in dark, matted hair, not like a groomed animal coat, but thick and uneven. The shoulders were massive, wider than a linebacker's, and the arms hung longer than they should on a human. Its face was partially hidden by the way the shadows fell, but I could see hints of a flat nose, deep-set eyes, and a heavy brow ridge. I saw its eyes reflect the faint light of my flashlight, two dull glimmers staring right back at me. My heart was hammering. I didn't say a word. Who would I talk to? I just stood there, breathing shallow, my mind screaming at me to get the hell out. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. The smell I'd noticed earlier was coming off this thing, I could tell now. It had this presence, like everything in that part of the woods belonged to it, and I was trespassing. Then it made this low, rumbling sound, like a deep chest growl or a strange, almost human mumble. It vibrated through the air, and I felt it more than heard it. I couldn't read its expression, but I knew it was not happy I was there. I took a half-step back, and as I did, I snapped a small twig under my foot, just the tiniest crack of wood. That sound seemed to set it off. The creature shifted its weight and stepped forward. Now I could see how big it really was, how easily it pushed aside a low branch like it was nothing. Its arms seemed long, powerful, and it moved with this quiet confidence that terrified me. I swear I wanted to speak, to say something like, "I'm not a threat," or "I'm leaving," but I couldn't get a word out. The moment it advanced, I spun around and bolted. I ran like I never ran before, pushing past low ferns, dodging under branches, barely keeping track of where I was headed. I just knew I had to get back to my field, back to the open space where I could see what was around me. I didn't dare look back, but I heard it following me. Heavy steps, branches snapping, that same deep rumble getting closer, then fading, then getting closer again. It wasn't screaming or roaring like in some Hollywood movie, just making these deep, frustrated sounds, like it didn't want me there and wanted to scare me off. I don't know how long I ran, but I remember the exact moment I broke out of the tree line. I saw the open field, the last light of day stretched over my small farmhouse, and I sprinted toward it like my life depended on it. My legs were shaking, my lungs were burning. When I was maybe 20 yards from my back fence, I finally risked a look over my shoulder. It had stopped at the edge of the forest. I could see it standing just inside the shadows, half concealed by leaves. It wasn't charging after me. It just stood there, watching. Even from that distance, I could sense it staring right at me. I swear it looked almost confused or annoyed that I'd gotten away. After a few seconds, it backed up slowly, and then I couldn't see it anymore. I rushed into my house, locked every door and window. I sat in my living room, sweating and shaking. I turned on the TV just to have some noise, something normal around me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every tiny sound outside made me jump. I kept thinking it would come back and break down my door. But nothing happened. By sunrise, I was exhausted. The next morning, I tried telling a few people in town. I'm not a known liar, so I think some believed I saw something strange, but I could tell they didn't really buy the whole huge, hairy creature angle. A couple of neighbors gave me that, sure look. One older guy I know said, "Might have been a bear, but I know bears. That was not a bear." Another neighbor just shrugged and said I was probably tired or stressed out. No one wanted to hear the details, and the more I tried to explain, the crazier I sounded to myself. I never found any hair clumps, no proof. I never saw it again. But the smell lingered in my memory, and the way it moved, the way it looked directly at me. Those are things I can't shake off. I've heard whisperings in town about old legends. Some people hint at strange sightings over the years, but no one ever admits it openly. Maybe they're scared of being ridiculed, just like I was. It's been a long time since that day, but whenever I walk near those woods, I get this uneasy feeling in my stomach. I still watch the tree line, expecting to see something massive and dark stepping out. It never does. The forest just sits there, quiet and ordinary. But I know what I saw. I know something is out there, something that decided to show itself to me once and then vanish like it never existed. I can't explain it. I don't have a neat conclusion or some grand discovery. All I can say is that it happened, and I've never looked at that stretch of Kentucky woodland the same way again. Story 7. I remember this happened back in the summer of 1998, when I was living alone near Willow Creek in Oregon. I had this small, run-down cabin not far from some of the densest forest I'd ever seen. I'd moved there after a pretty messy divorce, trying to find some quiet and piece myself back together. The place was nothing fancy, just a simple cabin near a creek, surrounded by pines so tall they felt like they were leaning over my roof. I spent most of my days just clearing my head, walking around, trying to figure out what to do with my life. That afternoon, I decided to revisit an old trail I hadn't stepped foot on in years. It was along this little stream that cut through a patch of woods deeper than I usually went. The last time I'd been there was before the divorce, back when I still believed I'd spend the rest of my life with my ex-wife. I guess I thought maybe walking that trail again might help me remember who I used to be, or at least help me find some calm. It was quiet that day, the kind of quiet that feels comfortable, not creepy, at least at first. I followed the creek, kicking through damp leaves, listening to the water trickling over the rocks. The smell of wet earth and pine needles was almost soothing. I didn't see anybody else out there. I doubt many people bothered with that trail. It was a bit overgrown, some branches scratching at my jacket, the ground uneven. I liked that isolation, at least until the atmosphere changed. About half an hour in, I suddenly realized something was off. I'd stopped hearing birds. Not a single chirp. No buzzing insects either. That might sound small, but when you're in the middle of the woods, it's never completely silent. The shift was abrupt, like someone hit mute on the forest. I stood still, trying to figure out what had changed. My heart started to beat a little faster. That's when I noticed these footprints on a patch of softer ground near the water. They were huge. I'm not exaggerating. Each print looked almost twice the length of my own foot, and I'm not a small guy. The shape was sort of human-like, but wider, and the toes seemed more spread out than any footprint I'd seen before. I crouched down to get a closer look, feeling my chest tighten. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this weird sensation, like I was trespassing somewhere I shouldn't be. I tried to think logically, maybe a bear print that got distorted in the mud. But bears have claws, and I should have seen at least some mark of that. These looked disturbingly like barefoot prints, just enormous. I followed them a few steps, not going too far, just enough to see where they led. They trailed off into denser brush, and I hesitated. Something inside told me not to push further. That's when I felt a presence. I know how that sounds, but I swear it felt like I was being watched, like I'd just walked into someone else's living room without knocking. My eyes scanned the trees, trying to pick out any shape that didn't belong. And then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, but there was definitely something tall standing a few yards away among the trunks. It was mostly covered in dark, matted hair. It wasn't a bear. Its silhouette was all wrong. Too upright, the shoulders too broad, the arms too long. My brain struggled to categorize it. It just didn't match anything I'd ever seen in the wild. I froze, my mind racing. I knew about the legends. Most people have heard the stories of strange creatures out in these woods. I'd rolled my eyes at them before. But now, I couldn't deny that something impossible was staring right at me. I could see it shifting its weight slightly, as if considering what to do about me. We made eye contact. Its eyes were dark, but I could feel their intensity, and I swear there was a kind of intelligence there, a recognition that I was something out of place. In that moment, my mouth went dry. I didn't know if I should run or just slowly back away. I tried to stay calm, but my muscles were tensed, ready to bolt. Then it let out this low, guttural sound, almost like a deep, vibrating grunt that hit me right in the chest. The sound was so low and resonant I felt it more than heard it. It wasn't a friendly noise. It was a warning, like it was telling me, "Get out of here." Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I started to step back, careful not to break eye contact too abruptly. My breathing was shallow, my heart hammering. The forest around us was still dead silent. I took one slow step back, then another. But I'm not as quiet as I'd like to think. My boot snapped a dry twig, and that sudden crack seemed deafening. The creature responded immediately with a more aggressive, snarling grunt, as if it was losing patience. I could feel the tension spike. That's when I turned and ran. I didn't think about looking back. I just ran, dodging low branches and leaping over mossy logs. The terrain was uneven, and I nearly twisted my ankle a couple of times. I expected any second to feel something grab me from behind. I half anticipated the sound of heavy footsteps giving chase, but I didn't hear anything except my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. It felt like it took forever to get back, but eventually I saw the roof of my cabin through the trees. When I reached the door, I slammed it shut and locked it. My hands shook as I double-checked the lock, and then I grabbed my father's old shotgun from the closet. I didn't even know if it was still in working order. I just wanted something, anything, that might give me a sense of security. I spent the rest of the day inside, feeling a kind of paranoia I'd never experienced before. The sunlight was still pouring in through the windows, but I lit a kerosene lamp anyway. Every sound outside, branches creaking, leaves rustling, made me jump. I kept thinking I'd look up and see it staring at me through the window. But there was nothing, just me and the silence. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat there listening, my stomach in knots, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, I went down to the small ranger station not too far from the main road. I told the ranger on duty what I'd seen. Of course, he looked at me like I was crazy. He said he'd check it out if he had the time, but I could tell he didn't believe a word. By the time I got to the local bar that evening, I made the mistake of telling a couple of people there as well. They laughed it off, made jokes at my expense. I ended up feeling stupid for even mentioning it. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt. That fear wasn't imaginary. I've never gone back to that trail. Hell, I started avoiding that entire section of the forest. And whenever I'm outside, I can't shake the feeling that something might be watching. Maybe it just let me go. Maybe it never cared about me one way or another. But I can't forget those eyes, that warning sound, and the way the whole forest seemed to fall silent in its presence. Over the years, I've tried to move past it. I've tried to convince myself that maybe I misunderstood what I saw, but there's a reason I still remember every second of that encounter, every detail of that giant footprint, every quiver in my stomach when I realized I was completely outmatched. It's something I can't explain, something I still don't understand. I don't have a neat conclusion. It just happened, and then it stopped. No explanations, no closure. Sometimes in the quiet moments I think back on that day and wonder what I interrupted out there in the woods. Whatever it was, I know I don't want to stumble upon it again. Story 8. In 2016, when I showed up in Alder Creek, Oregon, I had no idea that my short visit would leave me so shaken. I remember arriving there in late summer. The place was tiny, just a few old houses, a main road that barely looked like one, and this old wooden cabin belonging to an old friend who needed help fixing it up. The cabin itself was tucked away near a dense forest, with trees so tall and thick that even in the afternoon it felt like dusk inside. I'd been living in cities for years, so this deep green wilderness and the complete stillness out there felt almost too much to handle. But it was also oddly peaceful in its own way, at least at first. After spending most of the day patching things up, some loose planks, a door that wouldn't shut right, a couple of windows that needed reinforcing, my friend suggested we chill out by the nearby river and maybe catch some fish for dinner. It sounded like a great way to unwind. The forest wasn't my comfort zone, but the idea of standing by a quiet river, lines in the water, seemed relaxing enough. We took our gear and made our way through a narrow path that led to the water. The sun was dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was cool with that mild breeze you sometimes get just before evening sets in. I remember thinking how different it was from the noise and rush I was used to. We could actually hear the water gently flowing, the leaves rustling, and the distant calls of birds. For a moment I felt like I was right where I needed to be, as strange as that sounds. We tried our luck fishing, not really caring if we caught anything. We talked about old times, about the cabin, about how weirdly quiet everything was out there. The conversation drifted to nothing in particular, just comfortable banter. We were laughing at some stupid joke, something about how I didn't even remember how to properly bait a hook, when we both froze. There was this sound in the distance, something that didn't fit. It wasn't a normal animal call that I could recognize. It was deep, almost like a low growl, but it resonated in a strange way, coming from somewhere behind us in the forest. It felt too heavy, too low-pitched to be a deer or a bear or anything like that. We just looked at each other, confused. My friend suggested we check it out. I know, it sounds dumb now, but at that moment, we thought maybe it was an injured animal or something we needed to report to someone in town. We grabbed our flashlights, thankfully we had them, and walked back into the woods, following the direction of that eerie sound. The forest got dark fast under those thick branches. The ground was uneven, with roots sticking out, and the air felt colder as we moved farther from the river. I remember how quiet it got. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. After some minutes, we reached a small clearing. It wasn't a neat opening, more like a spot where a few trees had fallen or didn't grow so thick. We scanned around with our flashlights, and that's when I saw it. It was at the edge of our light, just standing there, watching us. At first, I thought it was a person, tall, broad shoulders, standing upright. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was covered in dark, matted hair. It was huge, at least a couple of heads taller than me, and I'm not short. Its silhouette was massive, like a human shape, but just off. Its arms seemed long, and it had this posture that was both human and animal at the same time. I couldn't make out a face clearly, not the details anyway, but I saw what looked like deep-set eyes reflecting the glow of my flashlight. It didn't run away. It didn't make any sudden moves. It just stood there, staring at us, breathing heavily. At least I think that's what that sound was. This low, menacing rumble came from it, like a warning. I remember feeling my heart drop. I felt this primal fear kick in, like my body knew before my brain did that we were in serious trouble. My friend grabbed my arm, and I could feel him trembling. I know I was too. It's hard to explain the feeling of looking at something you've been told your whole life doesn't exist. My mouth went dry, and my hands got clammy. I tried to swallow, but my throat tightened. We started backing away, as quietly and as slowly as possible, not wanting to provoke it. But of course we weren't in a tidy campsite. The ground was covered in dry branches, leaves, and random debris. The second I stepped on a dry twig, it cracked loudly. The thing reacted instantly, taking a few steps forward. Its movements were heavy enough that I actually felt the vibration under my boots. That's when we panicked. We turned and bolted, not caring about the flashlight beam bouncing wildly through the trees. I didn't think about direction. I just ran as fast as I could, trying not to trip over roots and rocks. Branches slapped against my arms and face. My lungs burned. I could hear my friend behind me, breathing hard, stumbling, and I could also hear something else, a heavy crashing through foliage, as if it was following us but maybe holding back just enough to keep us in sight. Time stretched and twisted in my head. I don't know how long we ran, but somehow, by what felt like pure luck, we found our way back to the cabin. We slammed the door shut and locked it. The cabin wasn't much protection, just old wood and a flimsy lock, but it was all we had. We tried to stack some furniture against the door and windows. There was an old shotgun mounted on the wall, but it had no ammo. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find, kitchen knives, a broken chair leg. We looked at each other, breathing hard and not saying a word. I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. What the hell was that? We listened. Outside, it was too quiet. That freaked me out, more than if it had been roaring or pounding on the walls. The silence felt alive, like something out there was waiting. My heart wouldn't slow down. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I remember sitting on a chair, straining my ears, unsure if I was imagining small noises, like soft footsteps on leaves or a faint rustling against the old wood. Maybe it was the wind, maybe not. I kept picturing that towering shape outside. What if it tried to break in? Minutes felt like hours, and the night dragged on. I don't think either of us slept. We just sat there, holding our pathetic weapons, listening, waiting, terrified out of our minds. No one had taught me what to do in a situation like this. I had grown up with stories about bears and mountain lions, but this was different. This was something I couldn't define. The uncertainty was the worst part. I kept expecting a sudden crash at the window or a roar that would freeze my blood, but it never came. Instead, just that awful tension, the feeling that something was right outside, watching. As the night finally gave way to the faint glow of morning, we decided we weren't sticking around. We gathered our things as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me forever to pack the essentials. When we finally mustered the courage to open the door and look outside, we saw no sign of that thing. The clearing was still, just damp grass and fallen pine needles. But something felt off, like the forest itself was keeping secrets. We never said a word about what we were running from. We both knew. We got into the car and left Alder Creek behind, driving straight until we hit a bigger town. I've been wrestling with what I saw ever since. I never went back to confirm anything, never looked for footprints or evidence. Honestly, I didn't want to know. My friend and I agreed not to bring it up with anyone. We both felt that no one would believe us, and we couldn't handle the idea of people laughing in our faces. It's not something you can easily explain. Even now, years later, I still struggle to put into words what that thing was. All I know is that it shouldn't have been there, or maybe it's always been there and we're just not supposed to see it. I still remember the weight of its stare, the way my body reacted before my mind could catch up, the hollow feeling in my stomach when I realized something impossible was standing just a few feet away. I have no neat explanation. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs or a man in a costume. But that doesn't match the fear I felt, that primal terror that doesn't come from seeing just any big animal. This was different. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened. We walked into those woods on a quiet evening, expecting nothing more than a peaceful moment by the river. We ended up running for our lives, barricading ourselves in a rickety cabin, and leaving at first light like we were being chased by a nightmare. And maybe we were. I don't have answers. I only have that memory, and every time I think of Alder Creek, I feel that same uneasy knot in my chest. It's like some secrets are meant to stay hidden out there in those dark forests, and we just happened to stumble into one of them. It still haunts me, and I guess it always will. Story 9. I remember that day in 2018 like it was yesterday. I'd driven out near Willow Springs in Northern California just hoping to clear my head for a few hours. Things at work were a mess, and I'd been arguing with my girlfriend a lot. I just needed some time alone, somewhere quiet, so I took my fishing gear and headed out to this spot I'd visited a few times before. It's a small river area, not well known, but it's peaceful. Usually I'd just hear the water flowing and maybe catch sight of a few deer if I was lucky. That morning felt normal enough. The sun was out, the air was fresh, and I could smell the damp earth and pines all around me. I set up my folding chair a few feet from the riverbank, got my rod ready, tossed in a line, and waited. Caught a couple of small trout, nothing big, but it was satisfying just feeling the tug on the line. I drank some cold water I'd brought in a thermos and watched the sky, listening to the sounds of birds rustling around in the branches. It was exactly the kind of calm I'd been hoping for. Then, around noon, or maybe a bit after, everything kind of shifted. The sky started getting darker, even though the forecast said nothing about rain. The wind picked up, and it got cold fast, which was strange for that time of year. I remember thinking maybe a storm was blowing in from the coast, but there was something else about it too. The sounds of birds stopped. I mean, it's not unusual for nature sounds to come and go, but it got dead quiet. The only thing I could hear was the leaves rattling. I started feeling uneasy for no clear reason, just a gut feeling. I was about to pack up when I heard this low, heavy sound from deep in the trees behind me. It wasn't a growl I'd ever heard before, not a bear, not a mountain lion, not a coyote, nothing familiar. It was deeper, almost like a guttural rumble. It made my chest tighten. For a second, I thought maybe it was a trick of the wind, but it came again, and I could tell it was definitely some kind of animal. I stood there, rod in one hand, the other hand still holding the half-open tackle box, trying to figure out what to do. I'd heard stories. Everyone has, right? You sit in a bar in these small towns and people talk. You hear whispers about weird encounters in the woods. Bigfoot stories, mostly dismissed as nonsense, but they're always hanging in the background. I never believed them. I'm not a gullible guy. But something about that sound made me think of all those old rumors. It got under my skin. I decided to check it out, which, looking back, might have been a dumb move. But I wasn't going to wander too far. I just moved a little closer to the tree line. I stepped carefully into the undergrowth, pushing aside some branches and feeling the damp, soft ground beneath my boots. The further I went, the quieter it got. That eerie silence pressed in on me. Then I saw these footprints, massive, human-like footprints sunk into the muddy patches between the roots. They were huge, way larger than any person I've ever known. It looked like someone with incredibly big, wide feet had walked through not long before I got there. My heart started hammering. I know what bear tracks look like, and these weren't bear tracks. They looked like giant human footprints, which made no sense. I took another step and froze. There was movement just ahead, between the trunks. I saw something tall, easily over 7 feet, and broad-shouldered, covered in dark, matted hair. I caught just a glimpse at first, like a silhouette, because it was partially hidden behind some brush. But then it shifted, and I could see it more clearly. Long arms, a cone-shaped head, thick hair all over. The face was partly obscured, but I could tell it wasn't a normal animal. The proportions were all off. It was something else. I don't know if it knew I was there right away, but I think it did. After a few seconds, it turned its head slightly in my direction. I felt my stomach drop. I tried to control my breathing and not make any sudden movements. I raised my hands a bit, almost like I was showing it I had nothing threatening in them. I've never felt so small and vulnerable in my life. I remember the wet smell of the soil and the faint hint of my own sweat. Everything else seemed to disappear. Then it made another sound, this low, rumbling growl that I could feel in my chest. It was like it was warning me, telling me I was too close. I didn't think. I just reacted. I slowly backed up a step. The thing stepped forward. That's when I realized how fluid and powerful it was. It wasn't lumbering like I'd imagine a bear would. It was more controlled, more purposeful. I panicked. I dropped my rod right there and turned around, pushing my way back through the brush. My heart was beating so fast I could hardly see straight. I stumbled over roots, got my jacket caught on a branch, scratched my forearm on something sharp. Every noise I made sounded too loud, and I kept expecting to feel a hand, or whatever, grab me from behind. I never looked back. I just burst out of the tree line and practically slid down the small slope back to my fishing spot. My chair, my gear, my tackle box, they were all still sitting there, but I didn't dare stop. I left the rod behind. I just grabbed my truck keys from my jacket pocket and sprinted over to my old pickup. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a couple of tries to get the key in the ignition. When the engine finally started, I peeled out of there, dirt and gravel spitting from the tires. I didn't even fully process what had happened until I was halfway back to the main road. I glanced in the rearview mirror and, for a brief second, I swear I saw it standing just at the edge of the trees, watching me go. It didn't chase me, didn't try to stop me. It just stood there, like it was making sure I left. That image still haunts me, the way it just lingered, like it owned that place. When I got into town, I stopped at a gas station. I went inside and tried to explain to the guy behind the counter what I'd seen. I was so rattled that my words came out jumbled, and I guess I sounded like a maniac. The guy looked at me like I was drunk or high, so I just gave up and walked out. Nobody was going to believe me. I know that. Who would believe some random story about a huge, hairy creature in the woods? People will say it's a bear, or maybe I was hallucinating or just making it up. But I know what I saw. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I haven't spent much time alone in the woods at all since then. The memory of that growl and those footprints keeps me up some nights. I didn't see any other people out there that day, and I wonder if anyone else has encountered that thing. I wonder if it's always been there, staying out of sight, watching people. It makes me realize we don't know everything that's out there, no matter how familiar we think we are with the land. I can't prove any of this. I have no pictures. I left my fishing rod behind and never bothered to go get it. But I know what I felt, that raw fear, that sense that I was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. And I know what I saw. I still don't have a neat explanation. I just remember that feeling of being watched and the sound of that thing's growl echoing in my chest. After it happened, life went on as usual, I guess. No big headlines, no one talking about sightings. It was just me with my own memory trying to make sense of it. I haven't been able to, even now. It's like it started and stopped in that one afternoon, leaving me shaken and unsure of what's really lurking out there. Story 10. I remember it clearly, even though it's been years since it happened. It was spring of 2009, and I was spending some time near Trout Lake in Washington, hoping to clear my head after a rough patch in my life. I used to do these long hikes around the area, nothing fancy, just quiet walks under tall pines, trying to enjoy the calm I never seemed to find elsewhere. I never gave any real thought to legends or cryptid stories. I loved nature, but I always saw it as just nature. Peaceful, sometimes surprising, but never something out of a monster movie. That afternoon, I decided to try a less popular trail on the edge of the forest. It wasn't hidden or anything, just one of those old paths less maintained, where the trees stood close together and the ground was softer with layers of old needles and moss. It was a mild day, the sunlight filtering through in thin streaks, and there were these birds, You could usually hear them the whole time, chirping in the background. But at some point, maybe half an hour into the walk, I noticed it got too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you stop and listen because it feels unnatural. I don't know what triggered me to pay attention, but suddenly I realized I couldn't hear a single bird. Even the soft rustle of the wind in the branches seemed to have paused. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I slowed my pace, trying to sense if something was off. My eyes drifted downward, and that's when I saw these footprints, or more like impressions, on the ground. The soil there was damp, not muddy, but soft enough to capture detail. They were large, much bigger than any human foot, and there was a weight to them, like something extremely heavy had passed through recently. They were spread out in a way that didn't make sense for a bear or an elk. I remember crouching down, running my fingers lightly along the edges. The stride suggested something walking upright, and the shape wasn't quite right. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some odd shape left by overlapping prints from different animals, but it was hard to convince myself. I pressed on, but much slower now. I had my flashlight and pocket knife in my backpack, though I didn't think I'd need them. Still, I made sure they were easy to grab. As I moved forward, something else caught my attention. A smell. It was strong, more like a sudden wave of stench than a gradual scent in the breeze. It reminded me of wet fur combined with rotten vegetation. Not so overpowering that I gagged, but it made my stomach turn a bit. I stopped, instinctively holding my breath, then exhaled quietly and kept going. A few steps later, shining my flashlight into a slightly denser patch of trees, I saw it. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. It stood there, half hidden by the trunks, taller than any person I'd ever seen, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. It was covered in thick, dark hair, and even in that dim light I could see the muscle definition beneath all that fur. Its head was shaped oddly, not like a bear's, and it stood on 2 legs. It seemed to be watching me, and in that split second my heart slammed against my chest. I froze, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles hurt. It didn't move forward right away, it just observed me. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I knew it was looking right at me. There was this tension in the air, like when you're too close to a wild animal and you realize you've made a mistake. Except this felt stranger, more intense. I remember my breathing becoming shallow. I didn't scream, didn't yell, just stood there thinking, this can't be real. Then it made this sound, kind of a low grunt, deep enough that I felt it in my chest. I don't know if it was a warning or just some sort of communication, but it made every hair on my body stand on end. I decided to back away slowly. I took maybe 1 step back, trying to show I wasn't a threat, trying not to appear panicked. But with every small movement I made, I could see it tilt its head slightly as if studying me, gauging what I'd do next. I was terrified. My mind was racing. What if it charges? What if I can't outrun it? At one point, I stepped on a branch behind me, and it cracked loudly. That sudden noise caused the creature to jerk forward a few steps in my direction. It moved fast, faster than I expected something that big to move. I didn't wait to see what came next. I turned and ran. I bolted down the trail, branches scratching my arms and face. My heart pounded so violently I could hardly think. I didn't want to look back, but I could hear it. There were heavy steps breaking through the undergrowth and the snapping of branches that shouldn't have broken so easily. I ran as if my life depended on it, not sure if I was making noise or if I could even hear myself over the adrenaline rushing in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, I just sprinted, dodging the rough bark of trees and half-rotten logs. At some point, I noticed the forest clearing ahead, the light of late afternoon filtering in more strongly. The smell that had clung to my nose seemed to fade. As I got closer to the open area near where I'd parked, the crashing sounds behind me started to drop off. My body was so tense that I didn't realize I was almost shouting inside my head for it to stop chasing me. When I finally stumbled out into the open, panting and shaking, I turned around just a little. I didn't see it follow me out. It was as if it had halted just at the edge of that darker part of the woods. Maybe it didn't like the openness or the brighter light. I don't know. I didn't wait around to find out. I rushed to my car, fumbled with the keys, and got inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away way too fast, probably kicking up a cloud of dust behind me. On the drive back, I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I was sweating, heart still pounding, and I remember feeling so vulnerable. I felt like everything I'd believed about what's out there in the woods had just been turned upside down. I didn't want to believe in monsters or whatever that thing was, but I couldn't deny what I had seen. It was there, it was real, and it was watching me. Back in town, I tried telling someone, just a guy I knew who worked at a local gas station. I didn't lay it all out. I just hinted that I'd seen something huge and strange out there. The look he gave me was enough to shut me up. It was that "you must be joking" face, but not in a kind way. More like he thought I was making it up for attention. I let it go, and I never brought it up with him again. I'm still not sure what I encountered that day. Maybe it was some kind of undiscovered animal, something that's just really good at hiding. I never expected to find anything like that, and I haven't set foot on that particular trail since. Every time I think about it, I get a chill down my spine. It's not about wanting to convince anyone. I honestly don't care if people believe me at this point. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The memory still makes my heart race, and the fact that I can't explain it, can't wrap it up into a neat story, bothers me. After that day, life went on, and I tried to push it out of my mind. But sometimes when I'm alone, especially if I'm walking somewhere quiet and remote, I can't help but remember. That silence, that smell, those footprints, and the tall shape lurking between the trees. It's like a permanent watermark on my memory. I never found a rational explanation, and it never happened again. It just ended. The woods went back to being the woods, and I went back to my ordinary life. But I'll never look at those towering pines the same way. It's like the forest showed me a secret it had been keeping, and then took it away just as quickly. I still don't understand it, and maybe I never will. Story 11. Back in the summer of 2015, I was living alone in this old wooden house in Reedsburg, Wisconsin. It was a place that had been in my family for years, inherited from my parents. The house sat at the edge of some pretty dense forest, and I liked the quiet. My daily routine was pretty simple. I spent a lot of time fixing old radios. I know it's a weird hobby, and tending a small vegetable garden out back. The days were slow. Nothing exciting ever really happened. That was just how I liked it, until that day. I remember it was late afternoon, the sun still bright, but not scorching. I'd gone out with some tools and my old beat-up cap to check on a section of fence along the far end of the property. There'd been a few boards coming loose, and I wanted to fix them before animals started wandering in. The walk back there was short, maybe 10 minutes, but I always enjoyed it. The grass and bushes, the smell of damp earth, the distant sound of birds. It was all so calm. Nothing ever felt off about that area until then. As I neared a slight bend in the tree line, I noticed something on the ground that made me pause. The soil was a bit softer there, still holding moisture from recent rain, and I could see footprints, large ones. I'm not talking about just a big guy's boot prints. These were shaped like human footprints, but at least twice the size of any human foot I've ever seen. The toes were distinct, like a barefoot print, not a shoe. My first thought was maybe a prank, some local kids messing around. but who would go barefoot in that thick brush? It didn't make sense. I stood there staring at these prints, feeling a weird chill creep up my spine. It's hard to explain, but the moment I noticed them, the woods got quieter. I'm used to hearing a lot of background noise, birds, squirrels, that kind of stuff, but all at once it was like someone pressed mute. I felt uneasy, but also curious. I decided to follow the tracks, just a bit, to see where they led. I moved deeper into a part of the woods I rarely ventured into. The trees grew closer together, and the light filtered through in strange patches. The silence kept getting heavier, like a pressure on my ears. I tried to be quiet, stepping over fallen branches and brush, but each tiny crack sounded like a gunshot in that unnatural hush. After a few minutes, I noticed something else, an odd smell, kind of like damp fur mixed with a musty, earthy odor. It wasn't overwhelming, just there, lingering. I kept moving until I reached a spot where the trees opened up slightly. I had to duck under a low branch, and when I straightened up, I saw it. Standing maybe 30 yards away, partially hidden by some thick trunks, was a figure. Tall, broad shoulders, covered in dark hair from head to toe. It stood upright, not hunched like a bear. Its arms were long, almost too long, and the way it held itself seemed aware. Not like an animal just standing there. More like it was trying to figure me out too. My heart jumped into my throat. I'd heard stories, of course. Everyone hears stories. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. But no one really believes that stuff until something like this happens. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, but also weirdly fascinated. I could make out the creature's face enough to see dark, deep-set eyes. They had a shine to them, something that reflected the dim light. It never snarled, never roared. It just stood there, watching me. I thought about turning and running, but I was worried that would provoke a chase, so I tried to slowly back away. I moved 1 foot behind me, and there was this loud snap as I stepped on a dead branch. The sound felt like a punch to my chest, and my pulse sped up so fast I got dizzy for a second. That's when it made a noise. It wasn't a scream or a roar. It was low and guttural, like a deep grunt or rumble that vibrated in my chest. It took a single step forward, just one, as if warning me. I lifted my hands a bit, palms out, the universal gesture of, I mean no harm. I couldn't think of anything else. My mind was racing. Should I speak? Should I stay silent? Eventually, I just took another careful step backward, never breaking eye contact. The creature didn't charge, didn't close the gap. It just stood its ground, breathing, watching, making sure I understood I was out of place. Little by little, I put more distance between us. Each step back felt like trying to defuse a bomb. When I was far enough, I turned slightly, keeping it in my peripheral vision. Once I reached a point where the vegetation thinned out and I could see the clearing near my house, I glanced back. It was gone. No sound of it leaving, no rustling bushes. Just gone. The woods were still quiet, but not as heavy as before. Somehow, that might have been even more unnerving, like it knew how to vanish without leaving a trace. I made it back to my house, legs feeling like rubber. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, and then just stood in my kitchen, staring at nothing. There was this feeling that I'd just crossed into some territory I had no business entering, that I'd witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. I tried to calm down, tried to think logically. Maybe it was a person in a costume, a local trying to scare me for some reason. But who would bother? And that smell, that presence, it didn't feel fake. It felt real, raw, and ancient somehow. For hours I just sat there in my living room. I didn't eat dinner. I didn't watch TV. I occasionally got up to peek out the window, half expecting to see it lurking at the tree line. But nothing. The sunset came, and the evening was just like any other evening. except for this pounding fear in my chest and the countless questions racing through my head. I tried talking about it with one old neighbor the next day. He just kind of chuckled, told me stories about weird things in the woods people used to whisper about. He didn't seem surprised, just not really interested in digging deeper. I couldn't get that thing's face out of my mind for weeks. Even now, I still think about those eyes, that quiet stance, the way it seemed to be testing my reaction. No matter how much I replay the scene, I can't make sense of it. It didn't attack me. It didn't chase me. It just stood there, like it was guarding something or just trying to figure out who I was. I can't say what it was with absolute certainty, but I know what I felt. I felt like I'd just stumbled into something beyond my understanding, something that's probably been there long before me and will be there long after. And I haven't told many people, because who would believe me? But every time I go into those woods now, I think about that afternoon, and I still don't have a clue what to make of it. It just happened, and then it was over, leaving me with more questions than I'll ever have answers for. Story 12. I remember it was fall of 1995, and I had gone up to my uncle's old cabin near Little Creek, Minnesota. I needed a break, something away from the noise and pressure of my job. The plan was pretty straightforward. I'd fish a bit, read a few books, enjoy the quiet. There was no TV, no phone, just the cabin's old furniture, a wood-burning stove, and a small lake a short walk away. On my second day there, I woke up early. The sky was a dull gray, a bit cooler than the previous day, and I felt like exploring. My uncle once told me about a trail behind the property that nobody really used anymore. He said it led into deeper parts of the forest, places even the locals didn't bother with much. I guess I wanted something different, a small adventure that wouldn't involve any real risk. I grabbed a small flashlight, my canteen, and a pocket knife, just in case. It wasn't quite dawn, but there was enough light to walk without stumbling. The trail started out as nothing special, just a narrow path through thick trees. I heard birds chirping and squirrels darting around in the brush. Everything felt normal at first, but maybe 20 minutes in, things shifted. It's hard to explain. The sound of birds grew softer, like they decided to leave all at once. The air seemed heavier. I know it sounds dramatic, but it really felt like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off, focusing on each step, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the smell of damp earth. But my spine started tingling. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you might not be alone. That's exactly what hit me. I paused near a cluster of pines and noticed something odd on the ground. Footprints. Huge, deep prints that didn't look like any animal track I'd ever seen. I'm not a hunter or a tracker, but I know deer, bears, and wolves leave certain shapes, certain patterns. These were different. They looked like massive human footprints, but wider, with toes that seemed too thick. My heart started pounding a little faster. The prints led off the trail into a denser patch of trees. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. I kept my flashlight at the ready, even though it was light enough to see. I think some part of me just wanted a sense of security, even if it was just a beam of weak light. As I moved deeper, the silence grew more intense. I could hear myself breathing loudly. The brush got thicker. Branches seemed twisted in odd shapes, and I had to push aside tall ferns and snagging vines. After maybe another 10 minutes of careful steps, I noticed a strange smell. It was musky and earthy, but with a sour edge, like something unwashed and wild. That's when I saw it. I caught a glimpse through a gap in the foliage, something tall and covered in dark, matted hair. It stood upright like a person, but it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Its build was heavy, muscular, and it had shoulders so broad they reminded me of a full-grown bear, but it clearly wasn't a bear. The moment I realized it was actually standing there, not just some trick of the light. My stomach flipped. This thing was real, staring right back at me. Its face was partly hidden by hair, but I could see dark eyes looking straight at me. They weren't blank animal eyes. They held some kind of awareness. I froze. I swear my body went cold. For a few seconds we just looked at each other. I tried to make sense of it. I had heard stories of strange creatures, Bigfoot sightings, but I always dismissed that stuff. Now I was seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that felt, I don't know, wrong. Not evil necessarily, but out of place, as if I'd stepped behind a curtain I was never meant to see behind. Suddenly it made a sound. It was a low, rumbling noise, almost like a bear's growl, but more controlled, almost like a warning. My heart was slamming in my chest so hard it actually hurt. I started to back away slowly, not wanting to turn my back on it. I tried not to make any sudden movements, but as I took another step, I snapped a dry branch under my boot. That crack echoed so loudly in the silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature raised one arm, and I could see its hand, massive, with thick fingers and what looked like nails or claws. I panicked. I just turned and ran. I didn't care about staying quiet anymore. I wanted as much distance between me and that thing as possible. I stumbled over roots, got scratched by branches, and nearly fell more than once. Every time my foot hit the ground, I expected to hear heavy steps chasing me, but I didn't hear it running after me. That absence of sound was almost worse, like it was toying with me, or just letting me go. When I finally burst out onto the main trail again, I ran the entire way back to the cabin. I locked the door behind me and pushed a chair under the knob, as if that would help. I was sweating, breathing hard, and my mind was racing. I spent the rest of that afternoon inside, pacing around, looking out the windows, expecting to see that silhouette pass by. Nothing happened, though, just emptiness and the wind rattling the old window panes. As the afternoon light faded, the forest outside looked normal again. Quiet, peaceful even, as if none of it had happened. The rational part of me said I'd imagined it, or maybe had seen a bear standing weirdly on its hind legs. But I know what I saw. Bears don't leave footprints like that. They don't move like that. They don't stare at you like they're trying to figure you out. By nightfall, I was too wired to sleep. I sat at the small table inside the cabin, an old oil lamp burning, replaying every moment in my head. Should I have stayed still longer? Should I have tried to run earlier? The what-ifs were useless, but I couldn't shut them off. I felt like I'd just glimpsed something I was never supposed to see, something that lived deep in those woods, hidden, existing in a space we don't even consider. The next day, I forced myself to go back outside. I didn't dare return to the same spot. Instead, I just circled the cabin and scanned the tree line. I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no weird smell. It was like nature had erased all traces overnight. I left that same day, cutting my trip short. I told my uncle I just wasn't feeling well. I never mentioned the creature. To this day, I haven't told many people because I know it sounds insane. I still don't know what I saw out there. Maybe I don't want to know. It never came after me, never hurt me. But it's the not knowing that chills me even now. I just remember those eyes, the quiet intensity. It felt like a reminder that we don't know half of what's out there. Sometimes I think back and wonder if it was just as curious about me as I was terrified of it. But that doesn't make it any less real. It happened, and I've never managed to shake the feeling that something out there watched me run away that day, letting me go back to my little cabin, my normal life, and all my assumptions about the world. I never got any answers. It started and ended that same day, a strange encounter in a quiet forest I thought was safe. And to be honest, I'm not sure I'd want to meet it again. It left me with a kind of uneasy respect for the things we can't explain. That's all I've got. No big reveal, no dramatic ending, just a memory that still makes my hands tremble when I think too hard about it. Story 13. I still have trouble believing what I saw that night in the Mojave Desert. I'd driven out there in early 2023, looking for something different, something far away from my usual forest trails. I've always been more of a mountain and woods guy, used to damp soil under my boots and tall trees all around, so the desert felt like another planet to me. The plan was simple. I would take these little back roads, find a good spot to set up camp for the night, and just try to absorb whatever the landscape threw at me. Maybe I'd come away with some cool stories, or a sense of stillness I never got anywhere else. I ended up near a place called Baker, California, but I wasn't in the town. I was out on some dirt route a good distance away, heading deeper into the Mojave. By the time I decided to stop, the sun was sliding down the sky, staining everything orange and pink. The horizon stretched on forever, and it felt both peaceful and a little eerie. I remember thinking how quiet it was. In the forest, there's always something rustling or chirping. Out there, it was this strange silence that made my ears feel like they were ringing. Every once in a while, I heard a faint breeze pushing through dry shrubs, but nothing like I was used to, just emptiness all around. I picked a flat spot off the main dirt track. There was enough room for my small tent, and I could still see my car just a few steps away. I set up camp quickly, just the bare necessities. A simple two-person tent, my sleeping bag, a small folding chair. I ate a quick meal, some canned stuff and a protein bar. Then I sat there watching the sky change. I wasn't expecting a show, but the stars began to pop out one by one, then in clusters. It felt like someone had just switched off any remaining daylight and painted the sky with galaxies. I tried to soak it all in. If I'd gone home right then, I would have been happy. It was worth the trip for that alone. I must have fallen asleep for a few hours. It was probably around midnight or maybe a bit later when I woke up. At first, I thought I was just thirsty or uncomfortable, but then I heard it, this low, guttural noise. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. At first, I tried to pass it off as the wind, maybe the way it cut through some rock formation. But the sound wasn't steady. It was irregular and strange, like someone clearing their throat far away, but with a deeper, almost vibrating tone. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again. After a few seconds, I heard it once more. My heart started pounding for no real reason, except that it didn't fit. I've been camping countless times, and I've heard coyotes, bears, mountain lions in the distance. This was different, much deeper, heavier, almost like a muffled growl, but not from any animal I recognized. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight and step outside, but I hesitated. It's not like I thought I was in immediate danger, but I also didn't feel right sitting in my tent, completely blind. Eventually, curiosity and a strange sense of caution got the better of me. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The desert night was almost black, with just a faint glow from the moon. I couldn't see much, so I stepped out, fully, with my lantern-style flashlight in hand, pointed at the ground so I wouldn't broadcast my presence too boldly. I stood there, adjusting my eyes to the darkness, trying to pinpoint where that sound had come from. I remember feeling this uneasy tension. The temperature had dropped a lot, and there was a chill in the air. The desert felt empty, like it was holding its breath. I took a few careful steps away from the tent just to get a wider view. That's when I noticed something against the faint outline of distant rocks. A tall, upright figure. It looked like it was standing on two legs, but it was hunched forward a bit. The shape was bulky, definitely larger than a person. I could see what looked like long, messy hair or fur hanging from its body. For a split second, I thought maybe it was a person wearing some kind of heavy coat, but that idea faded as soon as I saw how massive it was, I tried to stay calm and quiet, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature moved slightly, stepping from one side of the rock to the other, almost like it was trying to keep me in sight without fully exposing itself. I raised my flashlight a bit, just enough to catch a reflection. The thing reacted immediately. I heard a deeper, more agitated grunt, and it leaned back, away from the light. I didn't shine it directly at it because something told me that might not be wise. Instead, I lowered the beam, but now I knew for sure I wasn't imagining this. There was something out there, a tall, hairy figure that didn't belong in that landscape. I've heard stories about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, but I've always associated that with dense forests, thick canopies, places where such a creature could actually hide. The Mojave Desert isn't the kind of place I'd ever consider for something like that. I knew about desert animals, rattlesnakes, coyotes, jackrabbits. Not this. This thing towered above the rocks. I could vaguely see the outline of its arms, which seemed too long and dangled lower than a human's would. It had a broad, powerful frame. Even from that distance, maybe 40 yards away, I could tell it was strong, built like something that could rip through the brush without much effort. The weirdest part was the sounds it made. They weren't just random growls. They had a pattern, almost like it was testing my reaction. Sometimes it came out as a low hum, other times more like a short bark. The stillness of the desert made each sound carry in a strange way, like it was echoing off invisible walls. I felt vulnerable. There was nowhere to hide except my flimsy tent or my car. But my car was parked just a few steps away, and I considered for a moment whether I should just jump in and drive off. Yet, I couldn't make myself move that fast. My legs felt like they were stuck in place. I guess I was too fascinated, or terrified, to just bail out instantly. Part of me wanted to understand what I was looking at. I decided to slowly back up. I moved one foot behind the other, trying not to break eye contact, even though I couldn't really see its eyes. I just sensed that it was looking at me. As I stepped back toward my tent, the creature made another deep sound and then stepped slightly to the side. I couldn't tell if it was circling around or just repositioning. My flashlight's dim glow hit the rocky ground, and the edges of my vision caught its outline. It seemed to dislike the light, so I didn't point it directly at it. The silence between its sounds felt worse than the sounds themselves. At least when it made noise, I knew where it was. When it stopped, I was left wondering if it was creeping closer or backing off. I tried to steady my breathing, but I could feel my pulse in my neck. The dry desert air, the smell of dust, and that faint animal-like odor, something musky, hard to describe, are all etched into my memory. It smelled like sweat and earth, maybe a bit like wet animal fur left out in the sun. Not strong, but enough to notice. After what felt like forever, but must have only been a few minutes, the creature seemed to lose interest in me. Maybe it was just cautious. It slowly moved behind a larger rock formation and disappeared from my line of sight. I waited, half expecting it to reappear on the other side. It never did. Instead, I heard one last guttural sound, more distant this time, and then nothing. Just silence again. I didn't sleep much after that. I climbed back into my tent, zipped it up, and sat there with my headlamp on low, listening. My mind raced through possibilities. A prank, a guy in a costume, some animal with a weird shape. But nothing fit. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't seen another car or sign of people for miles. Why would someone be out here in the dead of night, dressed like that, making those sounds? And if it was an animal, what kind of animal stands nearly 7 or 8 feet tall on 2 legs and moves like that? I must have dozed off at some point, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. When the morning light finally crept through the tent fabric, I emerged feeling groggy and tense. The desert looked normal again, just empty and calm. I went over to the area where I'd seen the creature and tried to see if there were any tracks. The ground in the Mojave is mostly hard-packed dirt and rocky patches, but I found some impressions, big, wide marks that didn't match my boot prints or anything else I'd seen. They were spaced in a way that suggested something with a long stride. I tried to take a mental note of the shape, maybe about twice the size of a large human footprint, but with an odd shape. It wasn't clear enough to say it had toes or anything, but it was definitely bigger than anything I could explain. The rest of my morning was a blur. I packed up my gear, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see that shape behind me. Nothing else happened. By the time I got back to the main road, I felt relieved, but also rattled. Who would believe me if I told them I might have seen a desert Bigfoot? I told one friend after I got home. He just laughed and said I must have been tired, or maybe it was some drifter messing with me. But I know what I saw. The way it moved, the sounds it made, the size. That wasn't just a trick of the light. I'm not here to convince anyone. Honestly, I don't blame people for doubting it. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd be skeptical too. But I can't erase that night from my head. Even now I can picture the dark outline, the heavy breathing sounds, and how completely vulnerable I felt out there. The desert was supposed to be a quiet, empty place. Instead, it showed me something I still can't explain. After that night, I realized the world is bigger than the maps, and not everything fits into the categories we've made up. Since then, I haven't gone back to the Mojave. Maybe I will someday. Or maybe not. It's hard to imagine driving out there alone again, wondering if that creature is still lurking behind some ridge. I have no clue what it wanted, why it was there, or why it decided to reveal itself to me at all. That's the weird part. It just ended as abruptly as it began. One moment it was there, making those strange sounds, and the next it was gone. I'll probably never know the truth. All I know is that I saw something that night, and it left me with a cold, uneasy feeling that still creeps up on me whenever I think about it. Story 14. I still remember the exact day this happened. It was in late summer 2018, when I was living alone in that old family house near Reedsburg, Wisconsin. I had been staying there by myself for a while, restoring some old furniture and radios, trying to keep myself busy. The property was surrounded by fields and patches of woodland, and there was this old barn about a short walk from the main house, just a few minutes past a small stand of pine trees and a bit of overgrown brush. It was one of those days where the sunlight was warm and the breeze smelled like fresh grass. Everything felt calm, at least at first. I was headed to the barn to check on some old crates I'd left there. I'm not sure why I picked that particular day. I guess I'd finally decided to see if I could salvage anything else from the dusty junk inside. On my way, I noticed something was off. Normally the path through the pines was pretty ordinary. You'd see maybe a squirrel or some deer tracks, nothing unusual. But as I got closer to the barn, I started seeing weird signs, branches that were snapped way too high up for deer or even a large dog, and there were these huge footprints pressed into the softer patches of dirt. They weren't boot prints. They didn't have a clear shape I could identify, but they were big, heavier than any animal I knew around there. I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach. I'm not the type to jump to crazy conclusions, but something about those broken branches and tracks made my skin crawl. They looked fresh. I tried to brush it off, figuring maybe a bear had wandered too close. It wasn't unheard of, though I'd never seen one around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It's that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, like eyes are fixed on you. I moved forward slowly, pushing some branches aside, my heart picking up speed. When I finally cleared the last line of pines, I saw it. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It stood on two legs, tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark, matted hair. Definitely not a person, and not a bear. Its face was somewhat hidden in the shadows of the branches overhead, but I could tell it had forward-facing eyes, and they were locked right on me. I didn't know what to do. I just froze there, my mind racing. It was like time slowed down. I remember thinking that if I made any sudden moves, it might react, and I had no idea how. I raised my hands a bit, like some kind of instinctive sign that I wasn't a threat. I wasn't even sure if it would understand body language, but I had to do something. The creature didn't snarl or charge at me. Instead, it just stood there, breathing quietly, as if just trying to figure me out. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The silence around us was intense. Even the breeze seemed to die down. I saw a bird suddenly burst out of a nearby bush, flapping its wings wildly and taking off, startled by something. The creature's head turned slightly following that movement, and I saw its profile for a second, a heavy brow, a kind of flat nose, powerful shoulders. It was massive. I can't stress that enough. You just know when something is bigger and stronger than you, and I knew this thing could tear me apart if it wanted to. I tried to back away slowly, taking careful steps so I wouldn't trip or make too much noise. At that point, I just wanted to get out of there. I remember stepping on a dry stick. The crack echoed through that silent patch of trees like a gunshot, and I swear my whole body clenched up. In that split second, the creature let out a deep, low sound, some kind of guttural grunt or growl. It wasn't a roar, not even that loud, but it sent a wave of cold panic through me. My fight-or-flight response kicked in so hard I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't even think. I just turned and ran. I know you're not supposed to run from wild animals, but this wasn't a black bear or a cougar. It was something I couldn't wrap my head around. So I ran, stumbled through the underbrush, and sprinted toward the barn, barely noticing the branches scratching my arms. My lungs burned, and I kept expecting to feel something grabbing me from behind, to hear heavy footsteps crashing through the brush after me. But I didn't hear that, just my own frantic breathing and the crackling of leaves under my boots. When I reached the barn, I didn't bother looking inside. I just kept going, straight back toward the main house. I remember my legs feeling like rubber, like at any second I might collapse. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, as if a simple lock could stop something that size. Inside, my chest heaved, and I tried to process what I had just seen. I stood there for a long time, pressing my ear to the door, straining to hear if it had followed me. But there was nothing, just a quiet day outside. I checked the windows, half expecting to see a massive shape lurking at the tree line, watching the house, waiting. But I saw no sign of it. That calm afternoon light was still everywhere, and from a distance nothing seemed out of place. It was the strangest feeling, like I had stepped into a different world for a few minutes, and then somehow stepped right back out. Everything looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe it was just a huge person in a costume, or some freakishly large animal I'd never heard of. But deep down, I knew better. It was something else, something that isn't supposed to exist in any normal sense. I'm not a cryptid hunter or a believer in weird legends. I'd always thought the Bigfoot stories were silly, but now I was shaken to my core. I remember that evening feeling completely out of place in my own home, like the familiar rooms and furniture couldn't comfort me. I locked all the doors and closed the blinds, pacing back and forth. I tried turning on my radio, tinkering with it, doing anything to distract myself, but all I could think about was those eyes staring right into mine. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the silhouette of that thing standing there, its quiet, patient gaze sizing me up. If it had wanted to hurt me, it easily could have. That's one of the most unsettling parts. It chose not to. What does that mean? After that day, I never walked out toward that barn without a heavy feeling in my chest. For a long time, I avoided that path entirely. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I've never told many people because I know how it sounds, but I'm certain of what happened. That encounter felt so real, so immediate, that it still gives me goosebumps. Sometimes I catch myself peering into the trees, half expecting to see that shape again, just standing there, waiting, as if it never left. But it never showed up again, not that I know of. The world just went back to normal. People went about their business, the sun rose and set, and the sounds of the fields and forests carried on as usual. It's like that moment is sealed in my memory, a bizarre secret I stumbled into and then stumbled out of. I still don't know what to make of it. I just know I'll never forget those eyes and the quiet tension in the air when we stood face to face, both of us unsure what the other would do next. Story 15. I still remember how it started so normally. Back in August 2002, me and 3 friends, Horace, Felix, and Quincy, drove out to the Cascade Mountains near this tiny place called Darington, Washington. We'd been looking forward to it for weeks. It was our chance to escape our routines, to fish in a clear stream, and joke around a campfire without being bothered by the outside world. The plan was simple: hike in, set up a couple of tents near a creek, eat something warm as the sun went down, and then relax by the fire telling stories until we got sleepy. The afternoon went exactly how we imagined. We found a spot close to the water, where the creek flowed gently, and you could see the stones at the bottom. We pitched our tents, 2 small, worn-out ones that we'd all slept in dozens of times before. The late summer air was cool but comfortable, and as dusk started to settle, we cooked a basic meal on a small camp stove and then got a little campfire going. I remember how Felix, always the clown, started making jokes about local legends. He even brought up Bigfoot. The rest of us rolled our eyes and laughed. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, so relaxed that we could laugh at these old legends without a second thought. But that easy feeling didn't last. Sometime after the sun completely disappeared behind the pines, the forest around us got weirdly quiet. There was the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the creek, sure, but not much else. I didn't think much of it at first. We were far out, and maybe the local wildlife just settled down. Still, I remember feeling this subtle tension, like something was off. It didn't help that Horace seemed distracted, shining his flashlight into the woods more than normal, and Quincy kept suggesting we shouldn't wander too far if we needed the bathroom. Then the noises began. Nothing dramatic at first, just this occasional rustling where there shouldn't have been any. At times it sounded like heavy steps snapping twigs. We kept trying to lighten the mood. Maybe it's a deer, maybe it's a bear, that sort of thing. But I've spent enough time outdoors to know what deer and bears sound like. This was different. It was heavier than a deer, and the pattern of movement felt off for a bear. The tension between us grew. Felix, who had just recently been mocking the Bigfoot idea, went silent. I could tell he was getting nervous. None of us said it out loud, but I could see in their faces that they were thinking the same thing I was. Something big was out there, and it was close. At one point, Horace flicked his flashlight toward a line of dense trees and shrubs, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. He jerked his hand suddenly and caught our attention. We all looked over, and for a split second, I saw something that made my heart slam against my ribs. Between a couple of thick trunks, there was a tall, broad figure. It was dark, covered in what looked like hair or fur, and it seemed to be standing upright. It wasn't some blurry figure off in the distance. It was right there, big as life. Its shoulders were massive, and I swear I could see muscle definition even through the hair. Before I could really process what I was seeing, it moved. It shifted slightly, almost leaning forward, and made this deep, low sound that I've never heard any animal make before. It was like a rumbling growl, but there was a strange tone to it that got under my skin. We all froze. No one said a word, but I felt Felix's arm brush against mine as he leaned in, probably trying to see what I saw. Quincy took a step back, and I remember the sound of his boot scraping against a rock, making a tiny noise that, at that moment, felt way too loud. The creature, or whatever it was, must have noticed. Its posture changed. It sort of puffed up, and I felt this wave of instinctive fear telling me, this thing is huge, and if it wants to hurt us, it can. I've seen bears, I've seen large animals before, but nothing that made me feel so damn exposed and small. The fire crackled behind us, and I remember thinking how stupid we were to just sit there with that small ring of light. It felt like we were on display. I couldn't tell if the creature's eyes were reflecting the light, but I had the strong impression it was looking right at us. Felix started breathing heavier. I could actually hear him swallow, like he was forcing back a scream or something. Horace gripped the flashlight so hard I thought the plastic casing might snap. Quincy was whispering under his breath, telling us not to provoke it, telling us to just back away slowly. We didn't wait long. The second it took a step forward, we moved. Not fast at first, just this careful retreat. The creature gave another low, throaty noise. It wasn't exactly charging us, but it wasn't backing off either. I felt sweat trickling down my neck, and my ears were buzzing, like I was on the edge of panic. I reached down, desperately trying not to make sudden moves, and started kicking dirt and throwing a bit of water onto the fire. Horace helped me extinguish it as quickly and quietly as possible. The darkness got worse, but we had our flashlights, and maybe we hoped that dimming the firelight would make us less visible. The tents, the gear, none of it mattered anymore. We grabbed what we could, Horace's flashlight, my backpack with car keys inside, and Felix's fishing rod still folded. Quincy stuffed a few things under his arm. That was it. We didn't talk about the rest. We just left it there. Every time we stepped back a few feet, the creature seemed to mirror our movements, staying roughly the same distance away. I could catch glimpses of its shape between the trunks whenever we aimed the beam in its direction. It was keeping pace with us, not running, just following. It felt like a silent warning. I remember the walk back to the car vividly. It couldn't have been more than a 10 or 15-minute hike, but it felt like hours. The trail was barely visible, and our flashlight seemed dimmer than usual. Every snapping twig, every shift of branches overhead made me flinch. I kept expecting it to charge out at us. A part of my brain refused to believe what was happening. I mean, a Bigfoot. That's what people joke about, something you'd see on a grainy old videotape. Yet here we were, with this towering figure keeping to the shadows, close enough that I could sometimes hear its heavy breathing. We tried to hurry without breaking into a run. Running felt too risky, like it might trigger an attack, but not going fast enough felt like we'd never get out of there. We were stuck in this awful in-between state, moving as quickly and as quietly as possible through the dark forest, hoping we wouldn't trip and break an ankle or stumble onto something worse. A few minutes before we reached the car, I noticed the sounds behind us had shifted. The creature seemed to hang back, not as close as before. I don't know if it got bored or just wanted to make sure we left its territory. I never saw it step out into the open. It stayed in that murky darkness, always half hidden by the trees. Finally, we got to the old station wagon. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. Nobody spoke. We just piled in, slammed the doors, and took off down that forest road, kicking up gravel and dust in the headlights. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but all I saw was darkness and trees. No shape, no glowing eyes. Nothing following. It was like the forest swallowed that thing up the moment we left. On the drive back to town, the silence was almost worse than what happened out there. Everyone stared straight ahead, breathing hard, maybe trying to convince themselves that they didn't just see something impossible. By the time we hit the main road, I could barely think straight. My mind kept replaying that shape, that low rumble, and the way it moved. I felt a pit in my stomach that wouldn't go away. When we got back to Darington, it was late, and the small place was mostly quiet. We parked near a motel and just sat there for a minute, catching our breath. Nobody wanted to go to the authorities and say, "We saw a Bigfoot." We knew how that would sound. We knew what people would think. There was no proof. Our gear was still out there, our camp spot abandoned. We didn't even know if we could find our exact campsite again without risking another encounter. We all silently agreed it was better to let it go and never bring it up too seriously. To this day, I still don't know what we saw. I can't explain it. I've tried to reason it away. Maybe it was a bear standing awkwardly. Maybe it was some huge guy wearing fur or a costume. But none of that makes sense out in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, with no one else around. Whatever it was, it left a mark on me that I still feel. It taught me that not every story is as ridiculous as it sounds when you're safe by a warm fire. Sometimes when people mention Bigfoot or strange creatures in the woods, I just keep my mouth shut. I remember that night, and the way it felt like the rules of the world had shifted for a few terrifying minutes. We never went camping in those mountains again. If someone asks why, we just say we had a bad experience, something spooked us. Nobody presses for more details. And that's it. It happened, and then it ended, and I still don't know how to make sense of it. After all these years, it still gives me chills. Story 16. I still remember that evening in 2017 like it was yesterday. It was late summer, and I had been driving through the Ozark Mountains near Jasper, Arkansas, with no real plan. I had a rough old map on my passenger seat, a small cooler with some basic supplies, and a vague idea that maybe I'd camp out somewhere quiet. It wasn't my first time doing this. Taking off without a real schedule was something I enjoyed. It cleared my head, and I liked not being tied down to any fixed spot. That day, I'd spent hours cruising along twisting back roads, watching the landscape turn from farmland into dense forest and rolling hills. By late afternoon, I came across a dirt road that branched off the main route. It looked promising, so I followed it, passing under tall trees with their branches stretching over me like a canopy. Eventually, I found a small clearing by a creek. There were no signs or fences, and I felt pretty sure I was far enough from any houses or campsites to have some peace. The sound of the trickling water was relaxing, and the place just felt right. I parked my car under some trees and walked around to pick a good spot for my tent. The ground was fairly even, and I could hear a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. It was warm enough that I wasn't worried about getting too cold. After setting up my tent and unrolling my sleeping bag inside, I got a small gas burner going and heated up a can of soup. The sun was dipping below the tree line, painting everything in a soft orange glow. It felt calm, like I'd made the perfect choice for the night. By the time darkness fully settled in, I was leaning against a tree trunk, listening to the creek and the quiet hum of insects. The air smelled fresh, but also earthy, kind of damp and mossy. I remember feeling at ease, almost sleepy. There's something about being isolated like that which usually makes me feel safe, strangely enough. Out there, away from traffic noise and bright streetlights, I can breathe differently. It must have been around 10 p.m. when I first heard it. It was a deep, low noise, something like a grunt or a short bark, but not like any animal I recognized. I'm used to the sounds of the woods, raccoons, deer, sometimes even bears in other places. But this sound was different. It had a heaviness to it, almost as if something very large and weighty was letting out a muffled growl. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind moving through the branches in a weird way. or maybe I was spooking myself. But it came again, this time louder, and I swear I felt it more than heard it, like a vibration in my chest. Instantly, I felt that prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I reached for my flashlight, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The woods were pretty thick, and my tent and campfire were closer to the creek, so I had to shine the beam into the darker part of the tree line behind me. When my flashlight passed over a gap between some trunks, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart jump. I saw a tall, upright figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was covered in dark, matted hair and seemed incredibly broad-shouldered. I couldn't make out every detail, but the eyes caught the light in a strange way and reflected it back, almost like an animal's eyes at night. But this was no deer or bear. It was standing too straight, too human-like, but much bigger than any person I've ever met. My first instinct was to call out, to say something like, "Hello?" But my throat tightened. I just couldn't make a sound. My mind was racing, trying to put a name to what I was seeing. The word Bigfoot popped into my head, but it felt too ridiculous, too cliché. Yet there it was, something large, bipedal, and completely out of place. I kept the flashlight on it, and it tilted its head slightly as if studying me. There was a weird intelligence behind those eyes, not just a dumb animal reaction. It felt like it was sizing me up, deciding what to do next. I was too scared to move. I just stood there, holding my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Then I must have shifted my weight or taken a small step, because a branch under my foot snapped loudly. The creature reacted immediately. It let out a low, rumbling growl, deeper than anything I thought a throat could produce. My body tensed up. I don't know why I even bothered to speak, but I remember trying to say something, maybe "I'm sorry" or "I won't bother you." But no words came out. That's when it leaned forward. Not a big movement, just a few inches closer, but enough to tell me I wasn't welcome. It didn't charge at me, didn't scream, but that growl and that slight shift forward told me everything I needed to know. I had to get the hell out of there. My tent and most of my gear were behind me, but I didn't dare turn my back on it. I started stepping backward slowly, keeping my flashlight on it, my eyes locked on its silhouette. Every step I took, it watched me. At one point, I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, and I swear I saw it tense, like it might spring forward if I made any sudden moves. When I reached my tent, I quickly grabbed my backpack and car keys. I left most of my stuff behind, my sleeping bag, the little camp stove, the pot I'd used. None of that mattered. I just needed to get to my car, which was maybe 20 yards away. But to get there, I had to turn around eventually. For a second, I turned my flashlight away from it to switch to the car's direction. In that brief moment, I lost sight of it in the darkness. I whipped my flashlight back, and it was still there, just as before, watching me. As soon as I pointed my light away again and took a few steps, I heard the branches moving. It never made a full chase sound, never crashed through the forest. But I could sense it shifting, maybe following along the tree line. My heart was hammering as I reached my car. I was sure I'd see it charging at me at any moment, but when I glanced back, there it was, still standing, still watching, as if guarding that patch of forest. It didn't seem to want to leave the darkness. I could only see its shape and those eyes, glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight. I got in my car and started the engine, headlights cutting through the night. I half expected it to rush forward. Instead, it just remained there, a dark figure partially hidden by the branches. As I slowly rolled away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. I saw nothing chase me down the dirt road. The creature seemed content to let me go, as if its only goal was to show me I didn't belong there. Back on the main road, I drove in silence, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to go straight to the nearest town, find a sheriff's office, and report what I'd seen. But how do you explain something like that? I wasn't attacked, I wasn't hurt, and I had no proof besides a half-abandoned campsite and my rattled nerves. I could already picture the skeptical smiles and the nodding heads that suggest I'd been drinking or dreaming. Besides, I wasn't even sure what I saw. I ended up driving until I reached a small motel outside Jasper. I locked the door and just sat on the bed, staring at the wall, replaying the night's events in my head. I kept asking myself if maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs or some trick of the light. But I knew better. Bears don't have shoulders like that, and they don't stand so still and observe you like they're considering what to do next. This thing was different, something I can't easily label. In the following days, I didn't tell anyone. I guess I'm telling it now because I still can't shake the feeling I got out there, like I stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be witnessed. It's not that I believe every story out there about creatures in the woods, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a normal animal, and it wasn't a guy in a costume. The feeling of dread, the way it moved, the look in its eyes, those things are hard to fake, and even harder to forget. To this day, I don't have a neat explanation. I never went back to that spot, and I didn't even try to recover the stuff I left behind. It wasn't worth risking another encounter. I've gone camping since then, but I'm more cautious. Sometimes, even now, I get this uneasy feeling when I'm alone in the woods, like there might be something watching, something that prefers the dark and the quiet places, something that isn't interested in being understood. I still think about it at night when I can't sleep. That towering figure, the sound it made, the tension in the air. No one's ever given me a good answer, and I doubt anyone can. All I know is that I'm still here, and whatever it was, it let me go. I can't explain it. It just happened, and then it was over, as if the forest itself decided I'd seen enough. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has had a night like that out in the Ozarks, if maybe I'm not the only one. But that's all I have. A memory I can't fully process, and a sense of respect for whatever's out there that we don't understand. It still haunts me, even now. Story 17. Back in the summer of 2013, I took a short trip to a place near a little town called Green Valley in West Virginia. I was feeling pretty worn out. Work had been brutal, and I just needed a break from everything. I figured a weekend of camping in the woods might help clear my head. It wasn't my first time out in nature. I'm no survival expert, but I'm comfortable enough outdoors. I grabbed my gear, my tent, a basic supply of food and water, a small stove, flashlight, a decent knife, and tossed it all into my old car, heading off into those forested hills. The drive was peaceful. I left the main road for a smaller one, then an even smaller gravel path that wound deeper into the trees until there was nothing but old pines and oaks all around. I got there late in the afternoon, just as the sky was starting to go pink. I picked a spot that felt right, a flat piece of ground near a clear stream. It felt almost too perfect. The trees overhead formed a patchy canopy, letting in just the right amount of fading sunlight. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure it was stable, and gathered some wood for a fire. The air smelled clean, like damp earth and moss. The only sounds were birds, the gentle trickle of water, and the breeze rustling leaves. I remember sitting by the fire, sipping a mug of coffee I'd made with my little camp stove, and thinking this was exactly what I needed. As dusk settled in, things got quieter. The birds quieted down, at least the smaller ones, and I could feel the forest shifting into its nighttime rhythm. I'm not easily spooked, but I was definitely alert. There's always that moment, alone in the woods, where you realize you're not at the top of the food chain out there. Still, I had a decent flashlight. My car wasn't too far, and I felt okay. I was mentally running through what I'd need to do if a bear or something showed up. It's that standard checklist: stay calm, make noise, back away slowly. I'd never actually had to use that knowledge, but it was comforting to recall. It must have been around 9 or maybe 10 at night when I first heard it. A low, resonant sound from deeper in the trees. Not close, but not too far either. It sounded almost like a deep, steady humming, like someone exhaling loudly through clenched teeth or a distant moan, but not human. It was weird enough that my heart skipped a beat. I stayed very still, holding my breath, trying to pick apart the sounds in my head. Could it be a deer, or maybe a bear making some noise? But it didn't fit what I knew. Bears usually grunt or snort. Deer can make strange sounds, but this was different, lower, heavier, carrying an odd vibration. I shone my flashlight toward the direction I thought the sound came from. I didn't expect to see anything. Usually, you shine a light in the woods and see just trees and brush. But this time, I caught movement behind a thick trunk, something large shifting. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I had this nervous urge to call out, to say something like, "Hello?" But that seemed insane. Who would I be talking to? Then it stepped, or maybe leaned out from behind the tree. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, covered in dark hair that looked shaggy and uneven, not like a bear's fur. The shoulders were broad, the arms long, and it stood on 2 legs. The face wasn't totally clear from where I was. I remember seeing a hint of eyes reflecting the light, but I can't describe them perfectly. They just caught my beam and reflected back, like an animal's, but the stance, the shape, was different than anything I've ever seen. My stomach flipped. I was frozen, just standing there with a flashlight in one hand and my other hand halfway into my pocket, where I'd been reaching for my phone. It wasn't charging at the moment, battery was low, and even if I tried to snap a picture, I wasn't thinking about that right then. I was stuck between terror and confusion. This thing didn't snarl, didn't charge at me, but it made this low, rumbling sound, almost like it was warning me. I could see it shifting its weight from one leg to the other, kind of tilting its head as if studying me. I'm not some fearless outdoorsman. I'm an average guy who wanted a quiet weekend. Seeing something that big, that clearly not a bear or a person in a ghillie suit, my mind raced through all the logical explanations, but none of them stuck. Everything about its movements, the tension in its posture, was too natural, too fluid. If it was a person, they deserved an Oscar for that performance. But I knew deep inside it wasn't human. I took a step back, not taking my eyes off it. I remember stepping on a small branch. It cracked loudly beneath my heel. The sound seemed to startle it, or annoy it, because it let out another low growl, this one sharper. It felt like a direct warning. Don't come closer. The hair on my neck stood up, and I realized my hands were shaking. I lowered the flashlight beam a bit, not wanting to shine it right in its face. If there's one thing I knew, it's that wild animals don't like bright lights in their eyes, and I sure as hell didn't want to provoke it. Time felt strange. I can't say how long we stood there, a few seconds maybe, but it stretched out in my head. I took another slow step back, trying not to make any noise. It didn't follow me. It just watched. The silence in those woods was crushing. Even the stream seemed to quiet down. I kept backing away until my tent and campfire area came back into view. I noticed my fire had died down to glowing embers. I realized if I ran, I might seem like prey. So I just kept moving slowly, never turning my back fully. Once I was back at my campsite, I stood there a moment, breathing hard, waiting to see if it followed. Nothing. No sound, no movement. I guess it stayed behind in the denser part of the woods. My brain was screaming at me to leave, to grab my things and go right now. But it was dark, and packing up everything in a panic would make noise. So I settled on the next best thing. I quietly put out the remaining embers of the fire, took only my valuables and my keys, and made for my car. Leaving my tent behind felt stupid, but I wanted the safety of locked doors around me. I climbed into my car, locked every door, and sat there for hours. I kept the windows rolled up. Occasionally, I'd flick on my headlights and scan the tree line. I saw nothing. At some point, maybe around 3 or 4 a.m., I managed to doze off, but it was never a deep sleep. Every rustle or snap outside made me jerk awake, heart pounding. I felt like a prisoner of my own fear, waiting for sunrise like it was salvation. When morning finally came, I worked up the courage to go back to where I saw the creature. In the daylight, the forest looked so normal and peaceful, it almost made me doubt what I'd seen. But I found evidence. Large footprints in the soft dirt, way bigger than my boot prints, and shaped oddly, like a human foot, but much wider and longer. There were also these weird scratches on a couple of tree trunks, not like a bear's claw marks. They were more spaced out. I tried to fit my hand against one of them, and I couldn't even imagine the size of the hand that could have made those marks. I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Part of me wanted to stay, to try and see it again, to understand what it was. But a bigger part of me knew that staying was risky and pointless. I had no camera ready, my phone battery was low, and what good would it do to confront something like that again? I'm not a scientist, not a researcher. I'm just a guy who went camping. So I packed up my gear, leaving the site cleaner than I found it, and hit the road. Back in Green Valley, I didn't tell many people about it. Just a random old-timer at a gas station who gave me a knowing grin when I tried to describe what I saw. He didn't say much, just something like, "Oh, you saw it, huh?" That was it. No explanation, just a shrug and a grin that somehow made me feel less crazy. Over the years, I've looked into similar encounters online, other people who claim to have seen something large and hairy in the woods. But no amount of reading can really capture what it feels like to be there, staring at something that shouldn't exist, something that defies what we think we know about nature. To this day, I don't have a neat conclusion. I don't know what it was, or why it let me see it. I don't know if it was curious about me, or if it just happened to be there. All I have are those memories, my heart pounding in my ears, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and those huge footprints in the dirt. I've gone camping since, but not around Green Valley, and I'm always on high alert when I'm in deep woods now. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming those hills, avoiding humans as best it can. I guess I'll never know. The memory just lingers, a reminder that we still share this world with things we can't explain. Story 18. I remember that day in 1997 near Lewiston, Idaho, like it happened yesterday. I'd driven out early in the morning, looking for some quiet time away from my regular routines. I loved to fish back then, trout mostly, and there was this small, winding river I'd heard about, hidden away in a patch of forest that didn't see many visitors. The idea was simple. Spend the day out there, catch a few fish, relax, and just breathe in some fresh air. It was supposed to be a regular weekend getaway. That afternoon, I'd managed to find a spot that looked promising. It wasn't too far from where I'd parked, but it was secluded enough that I couldn't hear the highway noise anymore. There were tall pines, some brush, and the soft sound of running water. I set up a small makeshift camp right near the bank, just a spot to lean my things and maybe have a quick meal once I got a few fish. The weather was almost perfect. A nice mild temperature, a gentle breeze, and a blue sky with a few lazy clouds. For a while everything was fine. I caught a couple of decent trout, nothing huge, but enough to feel satisfied. The quiet was actually comforting then. No one around, just me, the river, and the distant rustle of leaves. I remember feeling my shoulders relax, the stress melting off as the day went on. At some point, though, as the sun started dipping lower, I noticed something was off. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment, but there was a sudden hush that fell over the place. The birds went quiet. The buzzing of insects stopped. It was like flipping a switch from a lively forest scene to complete stillness. I tried to brush it off at first. Sometimes the woods get quiet, maybe a predator passing through or something like that. Still, the silence felt weirdly heavy, like the air got thicker. I started scanning around, feeling a bit uneasy. My gut was telling me something wasn't right, so I got up and moved closer to the riverbank. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were in the damp mud near the water's edge. Huge footprints. I know bear tracks can look big and weird, but these weren't shaped like bear paws. They were more like giant human footprints, bigger than any boot size I'd ever seen. The toes were distinct, not like a boot imprint. I crouched down and just stared at them, trying to figure out who or what could have made them. I swear they gave me the chills. It felt like discovering that you're not alone in a place where you're absolutely certain you should be alone. I stood up slowly and looked around, feeling my pulse pick up. I noticed something, or rather someone, just beyond the tree line, about maybe 30 or 40 yards away. It was large, covered in dark hair or fur. At first I thought it might be a bear on its hind legs, but the shape was all wrong. It was taller and slimmer than a bear, and the way it moved, it was more deliberate, more cautious. The light was fading, but I could still make out its silhouette and those eyes. I don't know how else to say it, but it seemed to be studying me. Not just looking, studying. Its eyes caught what little sunlight remained and sort of glinted, like it was aware of me as much as I was aware of it. My heart was hammering. I remember swallowing hard, trying to think straight. There was no sudden attack, no dramatic charge. It just stood there, half hidden, like it was curious but keeping its distance. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it. But my brain was firing on all cylinders, telling me that whatever I was looking at wasn't a common animal. I took a step back, trying to move slowly and not make any sudden noise. The ground was covered in dry leaves and twigs, and they crackled under my boots. That's when it made a sound, a low, guttural huff, like a grunt or a warning. It reminded me of the sound a large ape might make, something with a lot of lung power behind it. That sound shot adrenaline into my veins. It was like hearing a very clear, "Don't come closer," in a language I couldn't speak but fully understood. I froze. All I could think was, "Get out of here now." I turned very slowly and started walking back toward my makeshift camp. My fishing rod, my small backpack, my lantern, they were all still there. I scooped them up in one smooth motion, shoving the rod into the pack and making sure I had my flashlight. The idea of staying out there overnight suddenly felt insane. The hardest part was leaving without running. I wanted to sprint, but I forced myself to keep a steady pace, all the while feeling like that thing was watching me, maybe even following me. The forest seemed darker than it should have been at that hour. Every tiny noise, a snapping branch, a rustling leaf, sent my heart into my throat. I felt like the trees were closing in on me and that I could almost feel eyes on my back. I reached the spot where I'd left my car. I was shaking, fumbling with the door handle. Once inside, I locked the doors immediately, like that would help, and just sat there for a second, breathing hard. It took me a couple of tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally started, I reversed out of there and headed back toward the main road as fast as I could without risking an accident. The whole drive back, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something huge and hairy lumbering behind me on the dirt road. No one was around to confirm what I saw. I knew that if I tried to tell people, they'd either laugh or tell me I misidentified a bear or something else. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The presence of that thing was too intense, too unsettling. It wasn't just a weird animal sighting. It felt like running into something out of place, something that shouldn't exist, but clearly does. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I stopped fishing alone in remote places after that. The memory stuck with me for years. Even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl. There were no attacks, no bodies, no dramatic finish, just this eerie encounter that ended as abruptly as it started. One moment I was enjoying a peaceful afternoon, and the next I was nearly paralyzed by fear and confusion. I can't explain what I saw, I can't prove it, but I know what it looked like, and I know how it made me feel. It's been decades, and I still can't shake the feeling that there's something out there, living its life just outside our normal range of vision. Maybe it's always been there, and maybe it still is. I still drive by that region sometimes when I'm in Idaho visiting family or old friends, and I get this uneasy knot in my stomach. I've never shared this story with them or anyone else in person. I guess it's easier here, where people might actually believe me, or at least keep an open mind. All I know is that day changed how I see the wilderness. What was once a comforting escape now feels charged with the possibility of things I can't understand. And every time I think back on it, I feel that same uneasy hush, that same strange silence that came just before I realized I wasn't alone out there. It was real. It still haunts me, and I don't think I'll ever fully come to terms with it. The memory just sits there, as vivid and puzzling as ever. I guess it always will. Story 19. I still remember that day in 2016 when I decided to head out to the Twin Lakes region in Oregon. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a chance to clear my head after some rough weeks back home. I'd been hiking on and off for years, nothing extreme, but enough to feel comfortable venturing out alone. I carried a small tent, a decent pack, a simple meal for the evening, and an old map I'd picked up at a shop near the trailhead. The idea was to get away from people for a bit, slow down, and listen to the sound of nature. The area around Twin Lakes had this raw beauty, dense trees, soft ground covered in pine needles, the subtle scent of evergreen in the air. I remember feeling relieved the moment I stepped off the main trail and onto a lesser-known path leading deeper into the woods. There were no tourists, no chatter, just the distant sound of water and the rustle of small creatures moving in the undergrowth. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating these warm patches on the forest floor. It felt welcoming, like I'd finally found a place to breathe without interruption. By late afternoon, I'd found a perfect spot to set up camp, close to where the two lakes almost touch each other, with a small clearing and enough space to pitch my tent. Nothing fancy, just a single-person setup. After arranging my gear, I prepared a simple meal, dried noodles and some jerky. I remember sitting there, leaning against a tree, sipping from my canteen, and thinking how lucky I was to be far from traffic noise and deadlines. The lakes were quiet except for a gentle ripple. Occasionally, a fish would break the surface, sending tiny waves outward. Everything felt so peaceful that I even dozed off for a bit, lulled by the distant babbling of water and the faint chirping of birds. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, the atmosphere changed in a way I can't fully explain. The wind, which had been gently shaking branches, seemed to fade out entirely. The usual forest hum, birds settling down, squirrels scurrying in the brush, insects buzzing, just kind of went silent. It was a heavy silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle. I remember looking around and thinking maybe a predator had moved into the area, causing everything else to hush. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I reached for my flashlight when I heard a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight, not too far from where I'd set up. It wasn't a small twig. It sounded more like a thick piece of wood giving way. Immediately, I aimed my flashlight toward the sound. At first I didn't see anything, just the dim silhouettes of trees. But then I caught a shape. It stood between two pines, and even though it was mostly in shadow, I could see it was tall, taller than any person I'd met, and broad-shouldered. Its body was covered in what looked like dark, shaggy hair. It was upright, but the posture was a bit hunched, like it was trying to stay hidden. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but I could sense it looking at me. The reflection in its eyes caught my flashlight's beam, giving off a subtle reddish glint. That moment knocked the breath out of me. I'd been in the wilderness before, but I'd never seen anything like this. My first instinct was to remain still, to not make any sudden moves. My heart was pounding so loudly, I swear, I could feel my pulse in my ears. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a bear on its hind legs. But I've seen bears, and this shape was different. Leaner, almost human-like in its limbs, yet definitely not human. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I remember gripping my flashlight tighter, feeling this cold sweat building up. I took a slow step backward, trying not to stumble. As my foot pressed onto a patch of dry leaves, they crunched loudly. That small noise felt like an explosion in that quiet. The figure responded with a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a deep grunt. It wasn't just a random animal noise. It felt like a warning. It made my stomach twist. I knew I shouldn't push my luck. I wanted to speak, to say something reassuring, but no words came out. I just stood there, my flashlight shaking a bit in my hand. After what felt like minutes, though it was probably seconds, I decided I couldn't stay. The tension was unbearable. I turned slowly, keeping the light lowered, and started walking away from my tent. I left behind some gear, my cooking pot, a small lantern, extra clothes. I didn't care. I could feel its eyes on me. Every step away felt like dragging my legs through thick mud. I didn't want to run, but I wanted to be gone. I moved quietly at first, then faster, until I was a good distance from my campsite. I found a more open area where the moonlight gave me some natural visibility, and I stopped to catch my breath. There was no obvious sound of pursuit, no heavy footsteps, no breaking branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew exactly where I was. I spent the rest of that night huddled under a makeshift cover of branches and leaves I gathered in a rush. I wrapped myself in my emergency blanket and just listened, heart still pounding. Every little noise made me jump. An owl's call, a distant splash in the lake, the shifting of leaves in a breeze that had returned ever so slightly. I barely slept. The stars were beautiful, ironically, but they felt detached from what I was going through. It's weird how in one moment the wilderness can seem peaceful and kind, and in the next it can feel completely indifferent, like you're just another vulnerable creature on its turf. I kept replaying that brief encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. There was no logical explanation. I knew about local legends, people claiming to see creatures in the woods, but I'd always assumed it was just stories or misidentifications. As soon as the first light touched the sky, I mustered the courage to head back to my original camp spot. The early morning air was crisp and smelled damp, and I tried to focus on the normality of that. When I got back, nothing was destroyed, but it all felt touched somehow. My tent's zipper was still closed. My gear was where I'd left it, though it felt strangely violated, like the atmosphere around it wasn't the same. I didn't find footprints, not in any clear shape, but the ground was disturbed in subtle ways I couldn't properly read. Maybe I was just on edge, but it felt like the forest itself was telling me to move along, not to linger. I packed up quickly, not daring to spend another minute there. My body was tense, my senses still on high alert. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see it again. No more growls, no more branches snapping, just the ordinary sounds of morning birds and the wind in the trees. It felt almost surreal, like I was stepping out of some nightmarish pocket of the world back into normal reality. If I hadn't left my gear behind and returned, I might have doubted my own memory. But the fear was real, the silence was real, and that figure, it wasn't a trick of the light. I never reported the incident. I knew no one would believe me. What would I say? That I saw a giant, hairy figure standing upright, staring at me from between the trees. Most people would laugh or think I was making it up to get attention, so I kept it to myself, turning the experience over in my head every once in a while. Even now, I can't fully wrap my mind around it. I try to rationalize. Maybe it was a bear, maybe some strange play of shadow and nerves. But deep down, I know what I saw didn't fit any animal I know of. To this day, I haven't returned to Twin Lakes. I keep wondering what that was. Part of me wants to forget it entirely, to write it off as a weird hallucination brought on by stress. But whenever I remember the sound of that growl, or the way the forest went eerily silent, I get that tight feeling in my chest again. It's a reminder that no matter how familiar we think we are with the outdoors, there are still things out there that go beyond our understanding. I guess I have to live with that uncertainty. No neat ending, no big revelation, just that memory I can't shake, the silence and the shadow that refuse to leave my mind. Story 20. Back in 2010, I spent a few days near Redwood Falls, Minnesota, trying to get away from my usual routine. I had planned to venture into a part of the forest that I'd barely found on an old map, somewhere not frequented by tourists or even locals. I remember that afternoon being almost picture-perfect, the light filtering through the trees, the subtle sound of the stream nearby, and just a comfortable silence that felt a world away from any city noise. I had my backpack, my tent, and a couple of basic supplies. I found a spot near a creek that looked ideal. I set up my tent, boiled some water for tea, tried a bit of fishing, though I'm not very good at it, and just enjoyed the quiet. I felt confident and at ease out there, like I was where I was supposed to be. As evening fell, I noticed a slight change in the mood of the place. At first, it was subtle, just a sense that the forest sounds had quieted down more than I expected. Maybe it was just that time when some animals settle and others haven't started moving yet. But it got to me. The wind had been gentle before, now it seemed to stop altogether, and even the insects felt like they were holding their breath. I shrugged it off and crawled into my tent, planning to get some early sleep. I wanted to wake up at dawn to do more exploring deeper into the woods. Before I drifted off, I remember thinking the silence was odd but not alarming. Just odd. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but it was definitely past midnight. I was jolted awake by a sound. Not a single sharp noise, but a kind of heavy breaking of branches, like something big was moving around close by. My first thought was a deer, maybe a moose. Those are large enough to make that kind of noise, but as I listened, the sound had a heavier rhythm to it. Not just random snapping, more like something deliberately pressing through the undergrowth. It took me a few minutes to build up the nerve to unzip my tent. There's that hesitation when you're alone out there. You don't want to overreact, but you also don't want to ignore something that might be a threat. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and immediately felt more exposed than I'd like. The night was dark. Moonlight filtered through some branches, but not enough to make out details. The sound was still there, a little further off, but still too close for comfort. I walked carefully in that direction, maybe 20 or 30 steps away from my tent, keeping the flashlight aimed low so I wouldn't completely give myself away. After pushing aside some ferns, I reached a slightly more open spot, like a small clearing. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, dark and tall. I moved my flashlight beam upward, and the light caught its eyes. The reflection was bright enough to make me suck in a breath. I saw fur, a lot of it, covering a massive frame. This thing wasn't leaning forward like a bear. It stood upright, with this powerful, broad-shouldered build and long arms that hung at its sides. It was at least a head or two taller than any human I'd ever seen in person. The legs were thick, the chest was massive, just an imposing silhouette with a hint of muscle definition that I could make out even in that poor light. I remember my heart racing so fast it felt like I couldn't breathe. I tried not to shine the light directly in its eyes again, but I'd already done it once by accident. That's when it made this low, resonant grunt, almost a rumble that I felt more than heard. I can't compare that sound to anything I knew before. It wasn't exactly threatening, not a roar or a snarl. It was more like a warning, just a deep, controlled vocalization that told me, in no uncertain terms, back off. I stood there, frozen for what felt like too long. In my head, I was screaming at myself to move. Slowly, I lowered the flashlight, trying to show I wasn't looking to challenge it or irritate it any further. I never considered running. Something told me that sudden movement would be a terrible idea. After a few seconds of this dead silence, except the pounding in my ears, I began to step backward, one careful foot behind the other. I never turned my back to it, not yet. I just backed away until I reached a point where I could turn and head toward my camp. It never rushed me, never made a move forward, but I could feel its eyes on me. By the time I got back to my tent, I felt my hands shaking. I was trying not to make noise as I grabbed my essentials, some warm clothing, my headlamp, water, and my small emergency kit. My camp had been cozy and comfortable just hours before, and now I couldn't wait to get the hell out. I remember feeling a wave of panic when I thought about how far I was from any main road. Every step I'd taken into those woods now felt like a bad decision, but I had no choice. I put out the few remaining embers of my small fire, careful not to make sudden noises or movements. I left behind my cheap cooking pot and a few other non-essentials. I just needed to get out without provoking whatever that thing was. My mind kept cycling through possibilities, a bear that looked weird in the light, a misidentified shadow, but deep down I knew it wasn't that. It stood too straight. Its limbs were shaped differently. It had a presence that I can't quite put into words, like it was something that just didn't belong in my understanding of what's out there. I started walking away, sticking to what I believed was the way back. The forest was eerily silent. No owls, no crickets, nothing that would normally keep you company at night. Every now and then, I thought I heard a branch snap behind me, as if something was still following at a distance. I never actually saw it again, but knowing it was out there made every step feel uncertain. My body was tense the entire time, expecting it to jump out at any second. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I found a more defined trail. It might have been the one I had come in on. I honestly didn't care. I just followed it. At some point, the forest started to thin out, and the night air felt less suffocating. I ended up finding a dirt road. I kept walking until I saw distant lights that hinted at human habitation. I didn't run into anyone out there. I just kept moving until I felt I was safe enough to stop and catch my breath. I never reported what I saw. I remember thinking about telling a ranger or a friend, but each time I considered it, I knew how it would sound. People would laugh, or they'd nod politely and move on. The memory was too raw and too strange to share casually. Over time, I tried to convince myself it was just a weird trick of the light, or maybe a misidentification of a bear standing on its hind legs. But I know what I saw, and it still keeps me up sometimes. The way it looked right at me, that deep grunt that felt like a warning, the sheer size of it, those details are burned into my mind. The oddest part is how it ended. I just walked away. It didn't chase me, didn't roar, didn't do anything you'd expect from a movie scene. It just let me leave, and the night closed back over that patch of forest like nothing happened. I reached civilization as dawn was breaking, with no proof of what I saw except a vivid memory and a racing heartbeat that took hours to calm down. To this day, I can't fully explain it. All I know is I never went back to that section of forest again, and I still think twice about going too far off the beaten path. It made me realize that there might be things out there that we barely understand, things that watch us from the shadows, letting us come close enough to see them once, then fading back into the silent darkness, leaving us with more questions than answers.